In the 6th century BC, 2,600 years before present, the very real person known as Pisistratus, who had already risen to and fallen from power twice as the city Athena's tyrant, made a third and final attempt to seize power of the city. After having been exiled from the city Athena twice already, when he returned from his second exile, he thought he needed a scheme to impress the people of Athena enough that they would allow him to rule as tyrant again. Pisistratus went to a nearby demi of Athena and found a 6-foot tall girl named Phia. Pisistratus dressed her in bronze armor and told messengers to go to the city Athena in advance to tell the Athenians that Athena herself was on the way to the city. When the Athenians saw Pisistratus alongside this fake Athena, they experienced a range of reactions. Emotions among the Athenians would have ranged from hope to fear, but underlying Pisistratus's ploy had to have been some system of belief that was waiting to be taken advantage of. What was evoked within the Brotoi, the mortals, was a shared fear of the Theoi, the gods. This is not to say that they were simply afraid of harm for irreverence, but rather that they were in awe of what Athena symbolized and evoked. At this time, this is before the Parthenon, on the Acropolis of Athena, there were several temples. One of them was known to the Athenians as the Hectompedon, the 100-footer. The Hectompedon's remains were found by modern people in piles of debris around the Parthenon. The Hectompedon was made of porous limestone, not the marble that the Parthenon and other later Athenian monumental architecture was made of. There are no reclining gods or demigods or tamed horses on the Hectompedon. Instead, its pediments are filled with monsters and animals. Among the animals, there's an owl, lions eating a bull calf, a panther, and snakes. All of these animals are predators in the natural world. In addition to the predators, there are also monsters on the Hectompedon. The monsters stand at the boundary between the Brotoi, the mortals, and the divine. They are intended to make people uneasy. The Hectompedon monsters are embodiments of primordial force and can be contrasted with the orderly world of the Theon and the Brotoi found later on the Parthenon. They belong to an older and more dangerous age. If the Parthenon represents observation, domination, certainty, reflection, and thinking, the Ectompedon could be described as its opposite. It represents fear, predation, uncertainty, action, and danger. The Athenians of that time dedicated what was possibly their largest building to these scenes: predators and monsters. This is the city Athena in which the complete surviving versions of Iliad and Odyssey were written. These written versions might have been written by scribes in archaic Athena in the 6th century BC. These versions are now known as the Pisistratian recensions, named after the person who may have commissioned their inscription, the tyrant Pisistratus. These written versions follow hundreds of years of oral tradition of tellings of the Iliad and Odyssey by rhapsodios, professional performers of these works. Even in antiquity, these works were attributed to a mythological figure known as Homeros, whose identity and biography have been the subject of dispute since this person's creation. The Iliad and Odyssey are in a subgenre of the mythoi, the myths unto their own. They have a very special treatment among the rest of the mythoi. It is called Homer. These are not just two surviving epic poems among many. They are the poetic masterpieces of the epic cycle that were preserved and distinguished from other mythoi by their length, scope, depth, and most importantly, by the way they tell their stories. Homer's accomplishment is not merely preserving episodes from the Trojan War and epic cycle tradition, but it is rather transforming selected stories from the epic cycle into works of extraordinary psychological, narrative, and poetic complexity. The other epics within the cycle did not receive a Homeric treatment, This distinction was already recognized in antiquity. How a story is told is more important than a basic synopsis. The Odyssey is definitely one of those stories. The distinction between Odysseus and the other heroes of the epic cycle is not enough to explain why the poem feels so different from the other epics. The Odyssey is purposefully disorienting and uniquely inventive in the way it is told. The audience has to navigate lies, rumors, variations of stories, memories, flashbacks, unreliable memories, unreliable narrators, contradictory reports, and nested narratives. These elements are rarer in the other epics. They are not told the same way. Odyssey, through Odysseus himself at times, tells stories within stories. Characters recount stories they heard from other characters. The listener is frequently plunged into multiple layers of narrative. This has the effect of making an attempt to construct a perfectly linear chronology of Odyssey difficult while the Odyssey is listened to. Like Odysseus himself, the audience becomes lost. Disorienting the audience serves a deeper purpose. The Odyssey is not simply a story about wandering, but a story that causes wandering in the minds of its audience. Unlike the Iliad, which is mostly concerned with growth, the gradual accumulation of conflicts and final confrontations and achievements, these often being portrayed in the poem as a linear development, the Odyssey is concerned with reflection. Odysseus has lived long enough to lose things, to regret, to remember, and to wonder whether his orderly life, where he is actually supposed to be, can ever be recovered. He has to contemplate alternatives to his former life. For example, Circe and Calypso are offering him opportunities to live in oblivion and forget his former life. The audience was well aware of genre. These stories were mythoi, and Homeric poetry was a particular kind of mythos. The mythoi formed a shared intellectual pursuit. On the edges of the comprehensible world of the ancient audiences, and depending on who one asked in antiquity, the physical world as well, lurked danger, trickery, monsters, and violence. So diversions away from the orderly world of the Brotoi. The Brotoi of the Homeric epics confront these forces directly. These works recorded and explained what awaited the Brotoi, the mortals, beyond the boundaries of the familiar and ordered world. The Muthoi were places where people explored memory, possibility, symbolism, ancestry, and meaning about their own identities. The poems were not sacred texts in the later sense, nor were they simply entertainment. Critics have been discussing Homer since antiquity because the poems resist a single interpretation. The Odyssey is not the beginning of modernity, nor the beginning of philosophy, nor the beginning of literature. Homer is not easily reduced to any one category. Some modern readers mistake its psychological realism for modern thinking. This is a testament to the poem's achievement rather than evidence that it belongs to a modern worldview. Odysseus feels human because he is an extraordinary portrayal of a human being. The experience of hearing Homer was unlike any other experience available to ancient audiences. Before widespread literacy, before a shared Greek identity, before philosophy, audiences heard these stories as an explanation of their past, their geography, their customs, and their place in the world. They used Homer as an explanation for nature itself. The audience themselves became defined by these stories. These mythoi were not separate from reality. In many cases, they explained reality. The audience may have questioned parts of the mythoi, but the poems nevertheless occupied the central place of their thinking. The stories explained who they were and where they came from. This interpretation raises broader questions. Is Homer merely explaining the world through monsters, gods, and supernatural stories? Is he providing answers to fearful or curious audiences? Or is he doing something much deeper? The poems contain abstractions, reflections on mortality, explorations of memory, examinations of leadership, honor, deception. They became foundational to later Greek thought precisely because they offered audiences a way of thinking about these subjects. Their influence was profound. The tyrant Pisistratus could reportedly use a woman dressed as Athena in a political procession because the Homeric imagination already occupied the mind of the Athenians. And Socrates could be condemned to death, possibly through quoting Homer because Homer remained culturally authoritative centuries after the poems were composed. These people without history created these poems after asking what happened. What happened before? The answer provided by the mythoi never settles entirely into literal history or complete fantasy. Like Odysseus, the protagonist, it remains between worlds, between certainty and uncertainty, between memory and false memory, or even lies, and it continually invites its audience to question what it hears. One of the elements that grounds the Odyssey in particular in reality, more so than in other surviving Greek epics, is that it uses an unusually detailed examination of human life. The audience is allowed to understand a culture at the level of everyday experience. The rituals people perform while preparing food, how they greet one another, how they transmit stories across great distances and periods of time. The audience contains more strong pastoral elements than other epics. Weaving, shepherding, farming, weather, livestock, and household labor appear constantly. This is striking because the genre itself is often disturbing and violent. It contains war, monsters, death, and shipwrecks. The mythoi are frequently violent in the genre. These events represent departures from an ordered world that the brotoi desire. Recurring scenes of ordinary activities, like weaving or animal sacrifice, or agriculture, function as reminders that the Odyssey also represents a normal human experience. It is even possible some of the formulaic language of epic originated in older traditions of singing associated with communal labor, and the poems are preserving the tradition of singing while working. The poem's treatment of violence also reflects Homer's complexity. Violence is frequent throughout Homer, yet it is rarely presented without consequence. The Cyclops kills Odysseus' companions, and the killing is compared to how a man could kill puppies. Warriors in the Iliad are earning kleos, its long-lasting glory, but the poem never separates glory from wounds, grief, and death. Heroes are said to consider cutting their long hair in mourning, marking a departure from their ordinary appearance. The Odyssey is portraying violence as a part of a perceived natural order, but it also has broad consequences afterwards. Odysseus and his family ultimately slaughter the suitors to restore order in Ithaca, but the Odyssey concludes not with endless revenge or celebration, but with Athena imposing peace. Violence exists, but it is not a final answer. The poem provides opportunities to wonder whether the mythoi shaped actual behavior of ancient people. Odysseus becomes more than a character. He becomes a mental companion. Ancient critics constantly disagreed about him. Some admired him, others condemned him. Some thought he acted wisely, some thought he acted badly. These debates have continued for millennia. The popularity and influence of the poem are impossible to measure precisely, but they are undeniable. What ultimately unites the Homeric poems, if there is any unity among their characters, may be the pursuit of kleos, loosely defined as remembered honor. The purpose of the Homeric poems is, in part, to satisfy their audience's curiosity and wonder about two subjects, a war and a journey. Complexities arise immediately from these basic settings, however, because they are not just any war and journey. The war and journey are about kleos of heroes, far-reaching fame and glory pursued within these settings. The Iliad is about the pursuit of kleos through conflict, the Trojan War. The heroes are not primarily concerned with geopolitical objectives or abstract state interests in the Trojan War. The wars begin for personal reasons, and the narratives remain focused on the personal forces that determine their course. The war serves as an arena through which individuals pursue reputation, memory, and recognition. It advances or diminishes their names. In this sense, the heroes become captive to the stories that will be told about them. If there is any single thread that binds together the many characters, traditions, and generations of the epic cycle, it may be the desire of the Brotoi to achieve a form of remembrance that survives beyond mortality. The Odyssey, on the other hand, explores what remains after such glory has been won and what life is like after a person has already been defined by their kleos. It is possible that the Iliad and the Odyssey were understood as taking place in different ages, and that through Homer, the audience was witnessing transitions between those ages. The Iliad is dominated by heroes seeking kleos. Achilleus, Agamemnon, Hector, and Aias pursue honor and glory, but the poem repeatedly demonstrates the injury and destruction of themselves and their people that this pursuit of Kleos causes. Achilles' wrath brings disaster upon the Achaeans, while Hector's commitment to defending Troy, ultimately leads to his death and the destruction of the city. The heroic age is magnificent, but it is also unsustainable. In the Odyssey, the Theoi still intervene, but the Brotoi have become more central. Odysseus succeeds not primarily through strength, but through his metis, his mental ability. By the end of the poem, when Athena commands Odysseus to cease his revenge against the families of the suitors and establishes peace in Ithaca, it feels as though the audience is entering a different age imposed by Athena. The age of heroes seeking Kleos gives way to an age of stability, rules, and the advancement of the oikos, the household, into what might eventually be recognized as a state. These poems may not simply represent different points of emphasis, but an attempt to characterize the past in chronological order. Viewed in this way, the end of the epic cycle could mark the end of the heroic age itself, the passing of the last heroes whose lives were intertwined with the Theoi. Homer stands at the edge of prehistory. The poems preserve how a prehistoric people may have understood both their distant past and their future. The epic cycle is not history in the modern sense, but an attempt by a people to explain a past adjacent to their own history. After the epic cycle, the heroic age is over, and the poems themselves seem aware of this. The poems are not isolated creations, but products of vast and varied cultural exchange over hundreds of years. Stories and motifs, and even names and themes, traveled across the Mediterranean for centuries before Homer. Some elements of the Odyssey may preserve memories from the Mycenaean world of the second millennium BC. Others reflect influences from Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Some stories may have been ancient even by Homer's standards, while others may have been comparatively new. The poets were expected to have vast amounts of knowledge from which they could compose their songs with divine help from the muse. The result is that the songs are layered in time. They contain traces of many different ages and many different peoples woven together in a single tradition. Modern scholars can identify influences and connections that neither Homer nor his audience may have fully understood. The Odyssey contains motifs that resemble stories from the wider Mediterranean. Odysseus' journey to the edge of the world and his encounter with the dead invite comparisons with Gilgamesh's search for Utnapishtim, a survivor of the Great Flood. Both heroes travel beyond the ordinary world in pursuit of knowledge unavailable to Brotoi, and the flood story itself belongs to a tradition that is already ancient by the time Homeric poetry was performed. Likewise, the Egyptian shipwrecked sailor, written down during Egypt's Middle Kingdom around 2000 BC, centuries before the traditional start date of the Trojan War, and nearly 1,000 years before Homer, tells the story of a sailor cast away by a storm onto a mysterious island inhabited by a gigantic supernatural serpent. The sailor fears for his life, but is instead welcomed by the serpent, who tells him he's going to survive and prophesies his safe return home, which he eventually does. The details differ from the Odyssey, but the combination of shipwrecks, isolation, encounters with supernatural beings, divine knowledge, successful returns home creates a similar pattern to readers of Odysseus's wanderings among the Cyclops, nymphs, witches, and sea gods. Similar connections appear in Anatolian traditions. The Hittites, whose empire flourished between roughly 1650 and 1200 BC, left behind myths, diplomatic records, and literary texts that reveal a shared Eastern Mediterranean myth-making environment. One example is the Song of Release, a Hittite Curian narrative preserved on clay tablets from the Late Bronze Age. The poem concerns disputes over captivities, kingship, divine judgment, and the destruction of cities, although it bears little direct resemblance to the plot of the Iliad. It demonstrates that large-scale narrative poetry dealing with human suffering and war, divine intervention, existed centuries before Homer, taking place where the Trojan War was fought. More broadly, Hittite archives preserve names and places that appear remarkably close to the worlds remembered by the Greeks. They refer to a western kingdom called Ahiawa, which could be the Iliad's Achaea, a walled city called Wilusa, which may be Ilios, after which the Iliad is named. Whether these identifications are correct in every detail or not, they suggest that memories of a late Bronze Age conflict survive for centuries, becoming part of the traditions preserved by Homer. Characters such as Nestor may embody this depth of time. Nestor is an old man within the Iliad and the Odyssey. The ancient audience knew he was old. They knew he remembered heroes who had died before the Trojan War. They understood that he represented a world already slipping beyond memory. When Nestor speaks in the Iliad, he recalls fighting alongside heroes such as Theseus against the centaurs, Theseus being a figure who belonged to an earlier generation of myths. Nestor also remembers wars and companions whom the younger warriors in Troy know only by reputation. He often feels as though he belongs to an older story than the one currently being told. At times, it almost seems as though Nestor and Odysseus belong to different genres within mythology. Homer belongs to a later world, looking back upon the age in which Odysseus lived, but the poems are also preserving elements of both past and Homer's worlds. Numbers, measurements, and quantities help give shape to the world Homer thought of in miniature. The catalog of ships in the Iliad lists possibly 1,186 sailing against Troas from approximately 164 places, described by their toponyms. Odysseus contributes 12 ships from Ithaca and the surrounding islands. Ancient estimates generally place a high end of 50 men on each ship, giving Odysseus a very high estimate of roughly 600 companions by the beginning of the war. By the end of the Odyssey, all of them are dead. The Trojan War lasts 10 years. The Iliad covers approximately 53 days near the end of the war. The main narrative of the Odyssey roughly occupies 40 days, although flashbacks narrated by Odysseus cover the previous 10 years of wandering. Odysseus spends 1 year with Circe. He spends 7 years with Calypso, and 9 days adrift at sea after leaving Ogygia before reaching Scheria. Telemachus is about 20 years old when the poem begins. having spent his entire life without his father. The wealth of Odysseus is repeatedly organized around the number 12. Eumaeus the swineherd on Ithaca describes 12 herds of cattle, 12 flocks of sheep, 12 droves of pigs, and 12 herds of goats. The repetition of this number, dodeca, 12, suggests completeness and proper order in the ancient Greek mind. The suitors number over 100 men. Homer gives the figure as 108. 52 from Dulichium, 24 from Same, 20 from Zakynthus, and 12 from Ithaca itself. Menelaus describes Egyptian Thebes as possessing 100 gates, through each of which 200 men with horses and chariots could pass. Egyptian Thebes was the richest city in the world at the time. The Phaeacians possess 52 men who serve as rowers in the personal retinue of King Alcinous. The bow contest in Song 21 of the Odyssey requires a man to string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow through dodeca 12 axe heads. None of the suitors can accomplish this feat. Odysseus succeeds immediately. Achilles' funeral games in the Iliad include chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, running, armed combat, discus throws, archery, and spear throwing, with the prizes carefully counted and distributed. Nestor claims to belong to a generation decades, perhaps even a century older than most heroes around him in the Iliad, and repeatedly compares contemporaneous warriors to earlier men who are greater and stronger than those now living. The Iliad contains 24 songs, the Odyssey contains 24 songs. The poems portray the natural world with extraordinary detail. Hundreds of species of animals are mentioned throughout Homer. Without animals, the Homeric world would feel incomplete. The audience understood animal behavior, ritual sacrifice of animals, hunting, herding, and the realities of life and death in a way that many members of a modern audience would not. Homer uses this knowledge of his ancient audience constantly. Human beings are compared to predators and prey. Warriors are compared to lions attacking flocks. The Cyclops devours Odysseus' companions like animals without performing any rituals. Nature is neither sentimental nor symbolic alone. It is a constant presence that helps the audience understand humanity's place in the world. This explains why animals appear thousands of times in stories that are about a war and a journey. The reason is that the Brotoi are just a part of the natural world. Any discussion of mortal human beings that ignores their place within nature would be incomplete. Homer constantly compares people to animals because he sees both participants in the same larger reality. Lions are violent, dogs are loyal, birds migrate, boars defend themselves. Human beings do the same sorts of things within their own spheres and are constantly compared to these animals. The philosophical substance behind the Homeric poems is therefore not dogma, but natural observation. Homer is interested in how living things behave. Nature itself provides the framework through which any acts by the Brotoi are understood. This refusal to impose a single dogmatic interpretation and this focus on the Brotoi as a part of nature, not as a better than or apart from nature, is one of the reasons the Iliad and the Odyssey can remain relatable across cultures and across thousands of years. The narratives and types of scenes found in Homer and throughout the epic cycle are remarkably open. There are few restrictions on the kinds of stories that can be told. Some scenes involve only theoi, such as the divine assemblies on Olympus. Others involve only brotoi. Some move freely between the worlds of the gods, mortals, include monsters, nymphs, dead souls, shades of the dead, and creatures that exist at the edges of the known world. This tradition is expansive enough to contain both the wrath of Achilles and the encounters between Odysseus and monsters. Parts of the poem may contain genuine memories of the past. Ancient audiences likely understood that the poems contained both fact and fiction, but they also wondered how much of each. Tross was a distant wonder to them, but it was important because it belonged to their deep past and explained who they were. At the same time, those beliefs can be undermined by the sudden appearance of monsters, gods, miracles, or Odysseus's own capacity for deception. The audience is always balancing belief and doubt. In terms of language, there are intentional connections within the Homeric poems, but there are also accidental connections to the past. Some Mycenaean echoes may survive in names, formulas, customs, and stories that Homeric poets inherited without fully understanding their origins. Through philology and archaeology, modern scholars can sometimes reconstruct these older layers. It is certain that some Homeric stories were already hundreds of years old, while others were relatively new additions to the tradition. Some may have changed very little over time, while others were continually reshaped by generations of singers. The Homeric audience likely recognized this dynamic to varying degrees. Some stories may have felt familiar and local, while others seemed ancient, distant, primordial, or almost impossible. Just as Odysseus listens to Demodocus, the bard character in the Odyssey, sing of events from Odysseus's own past, Homeric audiences may have been conscious that some stories belong to a deeper and more remote layer of the epic tradition than others. The heroes themselves belong to a time greater than the audiences present. In Song 5 of the Odyssey, the gods discuss the fate of Odysseus. The Theoi concern themselves with particular Brotoi because these heroes are exceptional. The audience understood that they could not compare themselves directly to Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, or Ajax. Whether or not they believe every event literally occurred, the audience recognized these figures belong to a world larger than ordinary life. Odysseus is the son of Laertes, the grandson of Acacius, while his maternal grandfather is Autolycus, the greatest liar in the world. Arcasius is the son of Zeus and Euryodea, whose name means of broad ways, which may have had nautical implications as well. The heroes of the epic cycle existed in a special age, one that stood between humanity and the divine. The audience is being purposefully split between the real world and the world history of the heroic Brotoi. They must consider the summary of events, the language used to describe them, and the meanings generated by that language. This does not require uncovering hidden secrets. Rather, it requires allowing their minds to remain in more than one place at a time. The purpose of the muthoi is, in part, to preserve and transmit the wisdom of ancestors. Family, heritage, lineage matter deeply to Homeric audiences because these things form the basis of their identity. Odysseus matters not merely because of his ancestry, but because of his experiences, decisions, mistakes, reflections, which are all described firsthand. This again splits the audience's attention between the action of the plot and their prehistory. It is no accident that the Odyssey begins by emphasizing multiplicity. Odysseus has the epitaph polytropos of many turns, and he wanders among many peoples, seeing many cities and learning many minds. The poem begins by explicitly saying this. The poem constantly returns to these ideas of plurality. Travel changes the characters in the Odyssey. It impresses itself upon the travelers. For audiences living in a world of smaller ships, uncertain voyages, and limited horizons, travel possesses enormous significance. Hospitality, called xenia, was therefore not merely a moral virtue, but a practical necessity. The hosts gain prestige, relationships, information, and opportunities through the reception of strangers. Travelers depended upon customs for survival. The cultural importance of Xenia was inseparable from the realities of movement throughout the ancient world. Communication from character to character in the Homeric works depends heavily upon taking seriously memory, direct speech, messengers, and personal trust. Even the way someone affirms a statement in the Homeric works often requires a lengthy affirmative statement, rather than the simple word yes. Even the word nay, yes, appears rarely in Homer. The epic cycle is a group of poems surrounding the Trojan War and its aftermath. One of the major subgenres within the epic cycle is the nostoi, the returns home of the heroes from Troy to their homelands. Unlike many heroes in the epic cycle, who are often defined by their qualities, or excellence in war, their strength, or heroic reputation, Odysseus is presented with a much greater variety of identifiable human qualities and flaws. He has his own doubts and emotions related to his immediate family. He worries about Penelope and Telemachus. He grieves for all of his companions. He repeatedly expresses his desire for Nostos. This makes Odysseus a more human and relatable character than many of his heroic peers. Achilles, who's young, sought Kleos above all else, but Odysseus, a man who's established his Kleos and outlived his men, is only seeking his return. In some respects, the Iliad is about understanding, certainty, and directness, while the Odyssey is about wondering. The Iliad allows the audience to understand Hector and Achilles and recognize their greatness and their extraordinary problems. Achilles' destructive wrath and withdrawal from battle are almost superhuman in their consequences. Hector is driven by his expectations of Kleos, and even as he moves towards death, he cannot escape those expectations. Odysseus, by contrast, is filled with uncertainty. Odysseus wanders through unfamiliar lands. He disguises himself, and he ends up telling stories whose truth is difficult to verify, and he continually encounters situations in which neither he nor the audience knows what comes next. The contrast can even be seen in the imagery between the two poems. The Iliad is about horses. Hector's famous epitaph is "Tamer of Horses." Horses appear constantly in the descriptions of warfare and the status of characters in the Iliad. The final line of the Iliad concludes with Hector's epitaph, "Hippodamos, tamer of horses." By contrast, horses are almost entirely absent from the Odyssey. Telemachus explicitly notes that rocky Ithaca is not suitable for horses, but the Trojan War itself is ultimately ended through Odysseus' most famous act, the use of a fake horse. Not a real horse, but a wooden one. Fake horse. This, of course, does not take place within the Iliad. It happens in the lost epic known as the Iliupersis. Odysseus can't compete with the horse-taming heroes on their own terms, so he triumphs through the invention of his polymetis, his many-mindedness. Strength is overcome by intelligence. The Iliad and the Odyssey are also very different in language. Even in Homeric Greek, one can see and hear the difference between them. The Iliad tends to be more straightforward, martial, and concentrated in its vocabulary. Iliad tends to use shorter words. It repeatedly turns to warfare, armor, wounds, horses, and frequent battlefield conflict. The Odyssey contains a wider range of vocabulary related to travel, storytelling, and its close relative deception, household life, Xenia, and foreign peoples and their strange lands. Even the sentence structures of the Odyssey often feel more exploratory with their vocabulary, reflecting the nature of Odysseus' journey. The difference is not merely thematic, it can be heard syllable by syllable and even physically seen on the page. The prominence of horses in the Iliad is particularly revealing, as Homer's understanding of these animals as symbols of aristocratic power, warfare, speed, wealth, and the prestige of the heroes in the Iliad. They are central to the identity of many heroes and cities. Their near absence in the Odyssey reflects the different concerns of the poems. Odysseus does not travel through battlefields, but rather across seas, islands, and the oikos of different peoples. The world of Odysseus is not organized around chariots and horses, but around ships, strangers, families, and the uncertain path of Nostos. Together, the two poems create a remarkably broad vision of existence, encompassing gods, mortals, war and peace, animals and humans, glory and survival, certainty and prophecies, but they do it in very different ways. In the Iliad, many of the characters believe their destiny and kleos will shape the world and endure forever. The fate of entire peoples and their cities hangs upon their actions. In the Odyssey, the journey is much more concentrated within the person Odysseus himself. It is an internal and subjective journey as much as it is external. The Odyssey concerns not only the world acting upon the hero, but also on Odysseus's own mind, and the ideas of others shape his experience. For example, Telemachus grows up hearing conflicting stories about his father. In Song 1 of the Odyssey, Telemachus says, "My mother tells me I am his son, but I myself do not know. No man ever yet knew his own father." The second general statement Telemachus makes, his lack of knowledge, shapes his identity and his actions. His journey is as much a search for certainty as it is for his father. One of the most remarkable features of the Odyssey, compared not only to the Iliad, but to almost any other surviving myth, is its use of nonlinear narrative and multiple narrative techniques. Homer employs time compression, multiple perspectives, framed narratives, retrospective narration, embedded stories, recognition scenes, shifting points of view, flashbacks, and different narrative voices. One of the clearest examples occurs when Odysseus reaches the Phaeacians. Rather than narrating his adventures as they happen when he encounters monsters, Homer withholds nearly all of them until Odysseus himself recounts these types of travels in first person, turning the hero into the narrator of his own past. Homer plays with time and perception constantly in the Odyssey, much more than in the Iliad. The result is a poem that feels often less concerned with chronological order than with memory, identity, and reflection, especially of its protagonist, Odysseus. The language of Homer is essentially artificial. It is exclusively a poetic language used only by Homer. It is a mixture of regional dialects that was never used as an ordinary spoken language. The Odyssey itself resembles Odysseus. It is assembled from many journeys, many places, many cultures, and many histories. Just as Odysseus moves through different lands and encounters different peoples, the language of the Odyssey moves through different dialects, traditions, and time periods. The audience is never entirely at home in the language of Homer. Homer ensures that the listener is slightly lost, always wondering about a word, a phrase, or an inherited formula. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the poem, but it is part of its power. The listener had to participate in a process of interpretation and wonder about the past. There are several dialects that comprise the Homeric epics, primarily an archaic form of the dialect Ionic, but there are also Aeolic forms and possibly survivals of Arcado-Cypriot dialect, and possibly what we now call Mycenaean Greek. No audience member would have felt completely familiar with all of the language used in the Homeric epics, or with the creative way these linguistic traditions are combined. In this respect, the experience of listening to Homer may not have been entirely different from our own experience of reading Homer in modern times. Parts of the language would have already sounded archaic, foreign, or inherited from distant places and times. The reason there are multiple linguistic layers is that there were multiple traditions behind the single work we now know as the Odyssey. The poem is a product of accumulation and preservation in combination within prehistory. According to ancient tradition, Pisistratus commissioned the Homeric songs to be arranged into a single text. Whether literally true or not, the tradition reflects an ancient awareness that the poems emerged from many performances and many voices across prehistory. There are words and grammatical forms preserved in Homer that had already disappeared from ordinary speech centuries before the poems were written down. The famous dative plural ending "esse" that is used in the Iliad and Odyssey is one example. Esse is an archaic Homeric Greek dative plural ending, meaning to, for, with, by, in, or among multiple peoples or things. Another linguistic fossil is the so-called digamma, represented by the sound w. It does not appear in the current versions of the Iliad and Odyssey available to modernity. This sound disappeared from most Greek dialects long before the classical period, yet its former existence can still be detected because it explains an otherwise irregular metrical pattern within the poetry. A poetic dactylic hexameter line may appear metrically imperfect until one reconstructs the lost w sound, revealing that the meter originally worked perfectly in Homer. No single member of a Homeric audience would have felt entirely familiar with every linguistic layer present in the poems. Parts of the Homeric language would have already sounded archaic, foreign, inherited, or poetic. In this respect, ancient audiences may have shared something with modern readers. They too were listening to language assembled from many times and many places. There is, therefore, no simple sense in which one can completely know Homeric ancient Greek. The language of Homer itself is multiple. It is better to speak of the languages of Homer rather than the language Homer speaks in. Homeric Greek relies on word endings rather than word order. The grammatical endings of words tell the listener who is acting, who is receiving the action, who possesses something, and how different ideas relate to one another. As a result, words can be rearranged far more freely than in some modern languages. There are four major cases that can vary these meanings. The nominative marks the subject, the accusative marks the direct object, the genitive means of or from, and the dative can mean to, for, by, with, or among. Homer also relies heavily upon participles, verbal adjectives, and they often contain information that would require an entire clause in English. A phrase such as Patroclus demes, Patroclus having been subdued, compresses into two words, which might require a much longer explanation in some other languages. It is difficult to translate Homeric Greek and to preserve the poetic nature of the work. For example, Song 16, Eumaeus the swineherd says to Telemachus that Telemachus always katadaimon, which translates to around the place where people are, a settlement, he's always watching the suitors. The Greek verb Eumaeus uses is theaomai, which is also where the word theater comes from. Telemachus is not simply looking at the suitors, he is observing them and measuring them. Greek verbs carry the following information. A single verb usually describes who is acting, when the action takes place, whether the action is ongoing or completed, and sometimes the verb even contains the speaker's perspective on the action of who is acting. Because so much meaning is included into one verb, it is difficult to translate the Greek into languages that do not have as much information in their verbs. Translators and even people who speak modern Greek and need to interpret the poetry, therefore, have to make choices about how to synopsize or translate the poetry. They are always in danger of losing meaning. Greek nouns, adjectives, participles, and articles are gendered, and this grammatical reality often shapes how the world is described. Masculine, feminine, and neuter forms are built directly into the language itself. The Homeric vocabulary, particularly in the Odyssey, is complex. Words such as thumos can mean spirit, courage, desire, or emotional energy, depending on the context. Kleos means much more than just fame. It is the enduring glory preserved by song itself. The poems also preserve rare words and even have some unique words. Some words appear only once in all surviving Greek literature. One example is katatheniotos, having completely died, a form found only in Homer and only once in all of Homer. It is not known whether this is a Homeric invention or a word that was used prior to Homer and had completely fallen out of use after Homer's single use of the word. The Homeric epics are composed in a poetic rhythm now known as dactylic hexameter. Each line would have been sung in 6 rhythmic units called feet. Most of these feet allow a pattern of 1 long syllable followed by 2 short syllables, though some may contain 2 long syllables. This regular rhythm gave the Homeric poems a distinctive sound, and they made them easier to perform and remember. An example to consider in Iliad Song 17, when Menelaus stands over the body of Patroclus after Patroclus has been overcome by the Trojans, and Menelaus is compared to a cow walking around her newborn calf. Amphidera toiben hostis peri portaki niter. The reason this poetic structure functions so effectively in Greek is that Greek words contain naturally long and short syllables. The meter therefore works with the language rather than against it. Homeric lines frequently contain pauses that correspond to grammar and thought in the natural speech patterns in Greek. The rhythm aligns with movement of ideas. When the Homeric poetry is sung, the poetry could flow naturally despite its complexity. Because the poems were performed by singers, they also relied on formulae, the traditional phrases that fit the meter. Expressions such as swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered Dawn, or gray-eyed Athena recur throughout the poems. These formulae helped singers compose and perform long narratives while preserving metrical consistency. The repetition is not a flaw, but part of Homer's style. Homer uses familiarity as a part of order. The audience hears known phrases, familiar epitaphs, recurring scenes, and expected patterns. These repetitions create stability within the narrative. Such formulaic order often appears during scenes of hospitality, animal sacrifice, subsequent feasting, reconciliation, and other moments in which the world is functioning properly. Many cultures find repetition, familiarity, and order beautiful. Homer's audience appears to have been no exception. Another device within the poetic structure of Homer, when a sentence continues across a line into the next verse, the phenomenon is known as enjambment. Homer uses this poetic tool, enjambment, when a narrative thought cannot be neatly contained within a single metrical line. Some enjambments are formulaic, while others generate suspense or emphasize important narrative transitions. The technique allows Homer to make the story flow between boundaries of individual verses while preserving the structure of the meter. The Homeridae, the traditional performers of Homer, whether understood as a hereditary group of performers, a community of rhapsodes, which were professional performers of epic poetry, or a later tradition associated with Homeric performance, represent another indication that there was a system behind the preservation of these poems. Homeric poetry was not merely memorized. It was refined and performed and was taught across generations. It was sung rather than simply read. Ancient Greek was a pitch accent language, meaning that variations in tone formed a part of the pronunciation. The poems therefore belonged as much to music and performance as they did to language. There were several methods scholars used to determine the age of the Odyssey within the oral tradition and to estimate when it was written down. The ancestors of the modern Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet in the early 8th century BC and created the writing system that would eventually preserve the Homeric epics. The poems occupy a special position because they are among the earliest and most significant products of this recovered literacy. At the same time, the dactylic hexameter preserves archaic words and forms that have already disappeared from ordinary speech by the 7th century BC. The poems therefore appear to stand at a meeting point between a much older oral tradition and a newly literate culture. Some scholars have suggested that the Odyssey may be somewhat younger than the Iliad, partly because it contains references to people such as the Phoenicians and reflects a Mediterranean world that resembles the expanding horizons of the 7th century BC. Whether or not this conclusion is correct, it demonstrates the poem contains layers from different periods. Some elements may be extremely old, while others appear more recent to Homer. External archaeological evidence provides additional support to dating the two poems. Archaeology reveals that certain objects described in the Homeric poems, such as boar-tusked helmets, which are sung about in Song 10 of the Iliad, correspond to artifacts from the Mycenaean Bronze Age, while other descriptions of armor and equipment, such as horse plume helms in Song 22 of the Odyssey, may reflect the 8th century BC. Scenes from the Odyssey, including the blinding of the Cyclops and Odysseus escaping beneath sheep, began appearing on Greek pottery during the 7th century BC. Later authors, such as Herodotus, quote Homer, established that the poems may have existed in recognizable forms before their lifetimes. Yet, because the stories circulated through generations of oral performance before being written down, there is no single year in which the Odyssey was created. Instead, the poem represents a gradual formulation of a tradition that stretched across centuries. This layered history helps explain why the authenticity of the poem continues to arise as a topic. Modern scholars identify certain passages as possible interpolations, lines that may have been added by later performers or scribes or editors rather than belonging to the earliest recoverable forms of the poems. Yet these debates are generally about small additions and adjustments rather than completely new inventions. Ancient editors such as Aristarchus of Samothrace worked from multiple textual traditions and attempted to remove what he considered to be inauthentic lines. His goal wasn't to expand Homer, but to recover what he considered to be an authentic Homer. Later Byzantine scribes also preserved the text through copying and commentary. They transmitted a poem that had already passed through centuries of oral and scholarly refinement. The Odyssey and the Iliad preserve traces of the long history of their transmission. Some scholars have suggested that in the Odyssey Song 7, which appears to praise the city Athena, it may be among the latest additions to the poem. Whether or not this is correct, it reflects a larger reality. Later communities, especially the city Athena, wanted to connect themselves to Homeric authority. Even questions such as whether the city Athena was named after the goddess Athena or vice versa were debated in antiquity. What is remarkable is that despite all of this uncertainty, the Odyssey, as a prehistoric work, survives as something very close to a complete performance. Much of the ancient world reaches us only in fragments. Peoples after Homer possessed broken statues, damaged temples, scattered inscriptions, incomplete tragedies, incomplete corpuses of tragedians, and poems that are preserved only through quotations. By contrast, Homer is unusually close. Even a modern audience possesses not merely pieces of the Odyssey, but the entire journey. The audience is still able to follow Odysseus from Calypso's island to the halls of the Phaeacians, through the underworld, back to Ithaca, finally to the restoration of his oikos. The poem remains one of the few surviving works that allow modernity to experience something approaching the full imaginative world of antiquity and even of prehistory. Homer is distant in time, but what he sought to deliver mentally, even on an individual level of complete character, is completely preserved. There is no biography of Homer. There is only the so-called Homeric question. The nature of Homer's biography is essentially a reconstruction of a possible individual or a possible type of individual who would have performed the Odyssey. The work is not Homer's as an individual. The rediscovery of the Bronze Age world behind Homer began in the modern era. For centuries, many people believed the Iliad and the Odyssey were entirely works of imagination. This changed in the 19th century when archaeologists began uncovering ancient sites connected to the poems. In the 1870s, the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated the site now identified as Troy. A few years later, Schliemann and others excavated Mycenae on the Greek mainland. In the 1900s, Sir Arthur Evans excavated Knossos on Crete and uncovered the ruins of the Minoans. Among the finds these archaeologists made on mainland Greece were clay tablets written in a script they called Linear B, which remained undeciphered until 1952, when Michael Ventris demonstrated that it recorded an early form of Greek. The Linear B tablets were comprised entirely of the administrative records of cities. Evidence also emerged from outside Greece. In the archives of the Hittite Empire, scholars discovered diplomatic letters and political records dating to the Late Bronze Age. Among the Hittite records was the Tawagalawa letter, which refers to a Western power called Achawa, which is often identified with Achaea, the Achaeans of Homer. The Hittite Manapa-Tarhunta letter also describes unrest in western Anatolia, which is where Walusa, Ilium, Troy was located. And other texts mention a powerful individual named Payamaradu, who was responsible for creating conflict throughout the region. These documents do not mention Achilles or Odysseus, but they did reveal a landscape of rival kingdoms and wars that resemble the world from which the Trojan tradition emerged. As a simplified timeline might help place these discoveries in context, 1600 to 1200 BC, the so-called Mycenaean kingdoms were present throughout Greece. 1250 to 1180 BC, this is the period often associated with the traditional setting of the Trojan War. In 1200 BC, the collapse of many Bronze Age kingdoms in the Mediterranean. In 750 to 700 BC, the Iliad and the Odyssey poems were taking shape in the form we recognize today. Together, these discoveries show that Homer's poems did not emerge in a historic vacuum. They preserve memories, traditions, and fragments of a much older world. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeology can uncover cities, palaces, clay tablets, but it cannot tell us how much of the poems reflect history and how much reflect centuries of storytelling. The relationship between Homeric poetry and historic reality remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. The social and economic structure of Homer's world is often less urbanized and more household, oikos-centered. This does not make it less sophisticated, rather, it reflects a different stage of historical development. The transition from the Bronze Age to the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial culture to the so-called Greek Dark Age, and finally to the Archaic and then Classical periods involved dramatic changes in literacy, political organization, settlement patterns, and the endonymic and exonymic identities of the peoples who lived during these periods. Writing existed in Mycenaean Greece through Linear B, then it disappeared for centuries, and later returned in the Phoenician alphabetic form. These stories take place in and around the transitions between these periods and represent an ancient Homeric interpretation and preservation of these periods. Even Homer's contemporaries and his near contemporaries were already discussing the nature of Homer's influence on their own world and the so-called Homeric question, which has occupied scholars for thousands of years. It was already present in ancient Greece. Greek cities held poetry competitions in which poets competed not only for prizes, but for prestige, authority, and cultural influence. Homer, in particular, held extraordinary authority. His epics were performed before audiences who may have lived in some of the very regions he described, lending his stories to a sense of immediacy and authenticity. The poet Hesiod similarly shaped Greek literacy and culture through his works such as Theogony and Works and Days, in which were publicly performed and carried moral and practical authority. The prominence of these poets sparked intense curiosity about the origins and identities of the Greek peoples who were the audience. The fact that 7 different cities claim to be Homer's birthplace demonstrates the desires of the communities of the people of Greece to associate themselves with the legendary poet. Once the connection between the Homeric poems and family genealogy began to become more attenuated, perhaps as the so-called Greek Dark Age was ending and the process of state formation accelerated, the value of the poems and repositories of family information within the poems may have been diminished. As this happened, attention increasingly shifted toward the singer, the performer, the Homeridae. The focus was no longer only on the historic ancestors described in the poems, but also on the individuals and traditions responsible for preserving and performing them. Part of the endlessness of the Homeric question comes from the fact that people investigating Homer are dealing with multiple layers of interpretation. There is their own reading, the readings of countless others before them. When they read or listen to Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, for example, who studied Homer, they may be interpreting Aeschylus's words for themselves, attempting to understand Aeschylus's intentions with respect to Homer, considering how Aeschylus's audience understood him in ancient times, and then tracing his inspiration, criticism, or engagement back to Homer. Homer himself is elusive, especially if the audience attempts to identify Homer as a single historical individual. It's impossible. Every layer of interpretation of Homer adds another level of distance between the audience and the original performances. The Homeridae, the traditions surrounding Homer's life, and the numerous ancient biographies attributed to him further complicate the picture. Ancient writers produced legendary and supposedly historic accounts of Homer, many of which contradict one another. These supposed lives of Homer often reveal more about the audiences who created them than about Homer himself. They also demonstrate the political uses of Homer. Cities such as Megara and Athena competed over Homeric traditions, while figures like Pisistratus became associated with collecting and organizing the Homeric poetry. In this sense, Homer was not merely a poet, but a cultural resource whose legacy was claimed, shaped, and deployed for political purposes. Homer, at least in retrospect, can also be understood through what the Iliad and Odyssey do not contain. Writing is almost entirely absent from the world of Homer. There is only one reference to writing, and it appears in the Iliad in Song 6, where a tablet containing deadly signs is carried, a written message intended to bring about death. Writing appears not as an ordinary tool, but rather something distant, dangerous, and sinister. The signs on the tablet themselves are mysterious. This is striking, as the Iliad is set in a region associated with Anatolia, where the Hittites and other Bronze Age states maintained extensive written records. There may well have been real diplomatic letters that inspired the letter that appears in the Iliad. Yet in Homer, writing does not organize society. It remains foreign to ordinary experience. Marble is never mentioned as a significant building material. Currency does not exist. There are no coins. There are no markets governed by money in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Formal law, written law, is absent. Disputes are settled through persuasion, customs, kinship, personal relationships, rather than through codified legal institutions. The world of Homer is also pre-philosophical and pre-political in the later classical sense. It is predominantly oral. Even something as simple as the color blue appears to be absent as a distinct word. Odysseus and Achilles are both described as having xanthos hair, a term that can be translated as blonde, golden, or yellow. Blue does not appear as a word in Homer. Homeric audiences perceived blue objects as shades. This issue is one of categorization and language rather than perception. Colors are usually described through their brightness or luster, or even comparisons to things in the natural world. The world of Homer is not geographically mapped, it is pre-geographic. The metaphorical language of the Odyssey and the world is understood through the theon, nature, kinship, memory, and direct skill and experience of the Brotoi rather than through abstract systems. The technologies of the poem reflect this world. Bronze remains the defining material produced through the combination of copper and tin. Warriors are repeatedly described as bronze-clad or associated with ponderous bronze. Ships are powered primarily by oars and simple sails. They are single-mast ships. The vessels of Odysseus differ significantly from the magical ships of the Phaeacians, which seem to anticipate their passengers' intentions. Technology exists, but it remains close to the people who use it. There is little separation between maker, owner, and object. This world also differs materially from the urbanized societies that followed. Settlements are generally smaller and less dense. Economic activity is often subsistence related. Labor specialization exists but is limited. A person's worth is measured through their expertise, craftsmanship, physical beauty, persuasive ability, their reputation, their family, their reliability, their ability to speak well, and their capacity to maintain relationships. Political life remained immediate and interpersonal rather than institutional. The material culture of Homer is personal and non-uniform, likewise. Many objects are bespoke rather than mass-produced. The skill of the individual craftsperson is visible in the object itself. Just as heroic leaders exercise direct and largely unmediated authority with their followers, the creation of material goods depends directly on the expertise of people who make them. In Song 9 of the Odyssey, the Kuklopes produces his own cheese and constructs the tools necessary for his own life. In Song 5, Odysseus personally builds his own raft under Calypso's guidance. In Song 2, Penelope weaves and unweaves Laertes' shroud with her own hands. In the Iliad, the most famous object in Greek literature, the shield of Achilles, is not manufactured in a workshop but forged specifically for Achilles by Hephaestus himself. Objects often possess histories, owners, makers, and identities of their own. Animal sacrifice occupies a central position in Homer, as it stands in their culture at an intersection of survival, religion, gratitude, and mortality. The audience knew the smell of roasting meat, the value of livestock, and the cost of killing an animal. Mycenaean tablets reveal that many animals even possessed human individual names, reminding us that these were not anonymous resources, but familiar parts of daily life. The poems display an awareness of finiteness and scarcity, interdependence on nature, and constant negotiation between human beings, animals, and the divine. Historically, one way of understanding the transition between the Iliad and the Odyssey is a movement from the memories of the late Bronze Age in the Mycenaean world toward the conditions more recognizable within Dark Age Greece. Agamemnon is dead, Troy has fallen, the great coalition of kings and chiefs has dissolved. One could even interpret Agamemnon's death as symbolically mirroring the collapse of Mycenaean civilization itself. The world of Odysseus is smaller and more fragmented, more local than the world of the Iliad. The great Trojan War is over, and what remains are households. Separate islands are being described, families with their own continuing problems, and questions of survival. Of course, none of this is to say that Homer and the world he describes is inferior, but is structurally different from later Greek civilization. It is largely a kin-based, household-centered, chiefdom-oriented society. The oikos, a household, is the fundamental unit of organization. Heroic values and warrior aristocracies occupy a more prominent place than formal civic structures. Political authority is decentralized and personal. Leadership depends upon reputation, the lineage of the basileus or onyx, the chief, persuasion, wealth, martial ability, and time, a concept related to honor. Terms such as Wanox, Onyx, and Basileus do not correspond neatly to the modern concept of king. The Homeric world lacks the formal institutions that would later characterize leadership of a polis as well. In place of bureaucratic administration, civic offices, and legal systems, there existed assemblies, personal relationships, reciprocal obligations, and face-to-face negotiation. For this reason, the Homeric epics resemble the primitive and prehistoric more than literature or history. The poems are deeply concerned with animals and the direct, rather than attenuated obligations to other people, and the place of the Brotoi within the world, rather than this world centered around a dominant Brotoi and their systems. In Homer, the forces of nature are often the forces of the gods, so personification exists alongside belief in the theon and superstition. Sleep is personified as Hypnos, who appears as an active divine force. Dawn is repeatedly personified of Rhododactylos Ios, rosy-fingered Dawn, who returns each day as though she were a living being. The sea is not merely water, it is connected to Poseidon and is frequently described in ways that give it agency, intention, and personality, often against the protagonist. Storms, winds, sleep, dreams, rivers, and even abstract concepts can become characters within the Odyssey's narrative. Yet events do not happen randomly. Things happen because of decisions, particularly of the Theon. The world is not fair, but Homer usually provides an explanation for why something occurred. Consequences follow actions, actions follow thoughts, and the thoughts can often be traced back to the Theon influencing mortal minds. Even when divine intervention is present, Homer remains deeply interested in the chain of reasoning that leads a person to act. The Odyssey is especially remarkable among the other ancient epics for its imagery, particularly its imagery concerning, to use a modern term, nature. The comparisons of Odysseus and Telemachus to birds of prey mourning stolen young, Odysseus's dog Argos dying after recognizing Odysseus, Penelope's tears melting like snow, or the sea appearing as a living force all create imagery of extraordinary vividness. The poem constantly moves between the human world and the natural world. This is not merely decorative. At the same time, the poem is functioning as a record of the geography, customs, hospitality, seafaring, economics, weaving, agriculture, and social relationships of the Homeric world. The Odyssey is both an artistic masterpiece and a record of how its audience imagined the world. There are even divine animals in the Iliad, such as the horses of Achilles, Xanthus and Balius, who are able to speak and, to some degree, even prophesize. The poems are constantly putting human beings within a larger living world, but never above it. There are, however, cases in which a modern audience may understand something better than an ancient audience through archaeology, comparative mythology, linguistics, philology. Modern scholars can identify influences and connections that Homer's own original audiences may not have recognized. We can compare Homeric stories with Hittite texts, Near Eastern myths, Mycenaean administrative records, and archaeological discoveries from Troy, Pylos, Mycenae, Knossos, and elsewhere. Modernity may recognize traces of earlier traditions preserved within the poems that even the performers themselves no longer fully understood. In this sense, understanding Homer is not always a matter of recovering lost knowledge. Sometimes it involved discovering connections unavailable to ancient listeners. The stories themselves also took time to become authoritative. People waited for the stories to be performed. They were heard repeatedly over generations before becoming definitive forms. The Iliad and the Odyssey gradually achieved a privileged status among many competing traditions. Other versions of the stories existed, but these poems increasingly became the standard against which other versions of the stories were measured. Critics and scholars often oscillate between trying to understand Odysseus as a character and trying to understand Homer as shaping the intelligence behind the poem. The tension even appears in antiquity. In Plato, for example, Odysseus becomes a philosophical problem as much as a heroic figure. In the Republic's myth of Odysseus is the soul who chooses a quiet and ordinary life after he experiences the extremes of heroism, and he's implicitly contrasted with figures like Achilles, who had a kleos driven path that represented different ethics. In the poet Pindar's works, Homeric heroes are frequently reactivated within a new moral framework that reshapes their meaning for new audiences. Pindar might occasionally diminish the supposed accomplishments of Odysseus, who he sometimes might accuse of lying even, to elevate his comrades who are lesser known. In tragedy, especially within the broader Greek dramatic tradition associated with the playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Odysseus often appears in morally ambivalent contexts. In plays concerning the aftermath of the Trojan War, Odysseus's cunning can appear as wisdom or manipulation, sometimes even cruelty, depending on the perspective of the speaker. Aeschylus appears to have taken a particularly skeptical view of Odysseus in some of his works. In the fragmentary satyr play Psychagogy, the Ghost Raisers, which was connected to Odysseus's visit to the dead described in Song 11 of the Odyssey, Aeschylus offers an irreverent engagement with Tiresias's prophecy that Odysseus would die a gentle death from the sea. Ancient commentators preserve stories in which the prophecy is fulfilled through unexpectedly indirect means, including a famous version in which a heron causes Odysseus's death through an infection after the heron defecates on Odysseus's head. This transforms Homer's solemn prophecy into something absurd. Whether this detail was actually in Aeschylus's play itself or a related tradition, it shows later authors felt free to not only reinterpret, but to even mock Odysseus in later works. Yet, the very fact that Odysseus and the prophecies about him had to be reworked and responded to demonstrates how central the Odyssey and Homer already was in their culture. Even when tragedians criticize or complicate Odysseus, they are still engaging with the narrative authority they cannot ignore. The poem's prophecies, especially those delivered in the underworld to Odysseus, contribute to this authority because they place Odysseus' life within a larger structure of fate and the expectations surrounding heroes that later writers had to revisit rather than simply abandon. This unstable interpretation of Homer extends into modern criticism, where a reader may consciously reject traditional interpretive authority and instead approach the Odyssey as something to scrutinize rather than absorb. One can choose to read it without privileging intentions to place the poets in a position of authority, instead focusing on textual inconsistencies, narrative problems, and possible historical residues. From these new perspectives, what matters is not only what the poem means, but what the poems preserve. Fragments of archaic culture, possibly even references to the Dorian invasion and replacement of the indigenous Pelasgians that may or may not be recoverable through archaeology, linguistics, and comparative myth. This approach also resists taking any narrator, Homeric or internal, at face value, instead treating the poem as a layered transmission whose reliability is always in question. Modern scholarship has also expanded this problem through oral formulaic theory, especially in the work of Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who emphasized that Homeric epic belongs to a tradition of composition in performance, during performance, rather than fixed authorship. Lord even explored how apparent contradictions can arise naturally in oral systems where singers adapt inherited material in real time. Later, scholars like Gregory Nagy further developed this model, asking how the Odyssey was transmitted over centuries before becoming textually stabilized. Related comparative works, such as studies of Slavic epic singers who still perform in modern times, shows how traditional poets can magnify inherited plots. They absorb multiple thematic strands, and during a performance, they effectively compress a wide narrative tradition into a single monumental performance, reducing a visible variety of the transition while intensifying its scale for a single performance. The Odyssey appears to be an epic that could have been formed in this way. Homer can be distinguished from his fellow poet and almost contemporary Hesiod. The heroes of Homeric poetry travel widely and endure shipwrecks, they fight monsters, spend years pursuing glory or homecoming. Hesiod presents a very different perspective. Although Hesiod's father was a sailor, Hesiod himself appears to have sailed very little. By Hesiod's own account, he may have made only one single short voyage across a strait to Euboea to compete in a poetry contest where he won a tripod. Odysseus spends decades wandering at sea in pursuit of Nostos. Hesiod crosses a narrow strait, he wins a prize through song, and then he returns home. This contrast is telling. In Works and Days, Hesiod offers practical advice about farming and household management and the proper seasons for sailing rather than recounting heroic adventures. The world of epics and heroic exploits had given way to the concerns of ordinary life. One could almost say that while Odysseus spends 20 years trying to return home, Hesiod makes a brief journey, wins a tripod, and comes back with a poem. The heroic age has become the age of the poets. This shift is also visible in later Greek writers. Thucydides opens his history of the Peloponnesian War by characterizing Homer's society and his technologies and scales represented. Thucydides notes that Homer does not even use the term barbarian, suggesting that the distinctions familiar to later Hellenes had not yet fully developed in the world presented by the epics by Homer. The people of Homeric poems, they're identified by lineage, region, and allegiance, rather than by a unified Greek identity contrasted against foreigners. Thucydides famous declares that city Athena does not need a Homer for its panegyrist, contrasting the tangible achievements of his own age with the poetic world of heroic memory. The heroic past and the historical present are presented as different worlds. The history of the Odyssey's reception also raises questions of translation and accessibility. When the Odyssey finally became widely available in Romance languages, it entered a new interpretive system in which annotation, dictionary-based reading, and scholarly apparatus became tools for navigating Homeric Greek. Even modern intellectuals treat Odysseus as a philosophical and literary problem. Some of the greatest artists who spoke Romance languages could not resist using Homer. For example, James Joyce used him in Ulysses, treating Odysseus as the most complete character in literature. Thinkers such as Sartre used existential framing of Homer to examine choice in narrative life. Voltaire and other Enlightenment figures engage Homer as a part of a broader critique of tradition and myth. Bernard Knox, the classicist, emphasizes that no two people will agree on Homer. Already in antiquity, audiences, performers, and later readers would have experienced divergent versions of the same myth material. At the level of narration, the Odyssey complicates identity itself. Odysseus is both a character, and in songs 9 through 12, especially, a first-person narrator of his own wanderings, while simultaneously existing in disguise for much of the poem once he returns to Ithaca. This creates a layered question. When Odysseus speaks as a beggar, is he producing the truth under concealment or strategic fiction under a necessity? When he tells his tales to the Phaeacians about monsters, is he reliable? Is he selective? Or is he actively inventing these stories? The poem deliberately keeps these possibilities open, allowing for the unsettling coexistence of a real Odysseus, a disguised Odysseus, and even a performing Odysseus. He often has clear motivation to lie for survival or persuasion or emotional control, but he also sometimes tells the truth while he's masked, which further destabilizes any simple idea about whether he is lying or telling the truth. This makes him not just an unreliable narrator in a technical sense, but a figure who embodies narrational instability itself and performance itself. A man whose identity is continuously produced through storytelling. The beginning of the Iliad and Odyssey say, "Tell me, muse." The muse tells the singer what to sing. The singer tells the audience. But what is the singer telling the audience? Sometimes it's Odysseus tells the Phaeacians. Characters repeat stories they heard from others. The audience loses track of certainty through these layers of transmission. Do we believe Odysseus? Do the Phaeacians believe Odysseus? Do we believe the Phaeacians believe Odysseus? The poem repeatedly shifts our attention away from the question of whether a story is true, and it turns the audience toward the question of how people respond to stories. This is particularly visible in the Cretan lies and in Odysseus's conversations with Eumaeus the swineherd on Ithaca. In Song 14, Eumaeus says he met a wanderer who claimed to have seen Odysseus alive in Crete. Eumaeus admits that he was deceived by the tale. The irony is that he tells this story to the real Odysseus, who is simultaneously inventing new stories about himself. Odysseus becomes a myth maker within a myth. There's the real Odysseus, disguised Odysseus, the rumored Odysseus, and the Odysseus invented by Odysseus himself. Rumors about him spread throughout the Mediterranean and take on lives of their own. Truth becomes difficult to separate from invention. The structure of the poem itself mirrors the way stories spread, change, and accumulate over time. This openness of narrative types allows the Odyssey to never live fully in fact or fiction. It never commits completely to either. There are real places, real customs, and recognizable geography that exist alongside monsters, nymphs, intervention by the Phaon, and the journeys to the underworld. The audience never feels entirely convinced that every detail is historical, yet it also rarely feels that everything is pure imagination. This ambiguity is not a flaw in Homer, it is one of the sources of Homer's endurance, because ancient audiences were asking these same questions that modern audiences do. The Odyssey is deliberately slippery and decentralized. It exists somewhere between fact and fiction. It's between memory and invention by Homer, who had an ambiguous identity, the singer, the performer, who is being inspired by tradition and supposedly by a muse whose identity was not entirely tangible, and they are often being fed stories within the story by Polymetus, many-minded Odysseus, who's the grandson of the greatest liar and perjurer in history, Autolycus. Ancient audiences were aware that the genre operated within this space. The description of Ithaca in Song 13. At the head of the harbor is a long-leaved olive tree, and nearby a beautiful dark cave that is said to be sacred to the nymphs. These details are the description of an actual place that a listener could imagine visiting, yet the same cave is said to be inhabited by nymphs. The Odyssey combines realistic geography with mythical elements in this way. As a result, the Odyssey resists belonging entirely to any one degree of historiographic interpretation. It's evading any modern claim that it is purely historical or that it is purely fictional. It belongs neither entirely to one people, even any ancient people, nor entirely to one period. This openness is one of the reasons it has remained a subject of interpretation. The blind singer, the bard Demodocus in Odyssey Song 8, who is performing songs that include the Trojan War, and even an episode involving Odysseus and Achilles, embodies this multiplicity. Demodocus sings about a disagreement between Odysseus and Achilles at a feast. Odysseus himself listens as an audience member to a story about himself that appears nowhere else in the surviving epic tradition, this quarrel between him and Achilles. That absence makes a point. Even if Homer or later editorial traditions associated with figures like Pisistratus help stabilize the text, what survives is still the endpoint of an extraordinarily long and varied process of transmission of these stories that stretch across centuries, in which no single version could ever fully exhaust the meaning of the poems. The influence of the Odyssey and the Homeric poems more generally seems so extensive that it raises the question of whether something resembling a Homeric culture or a Homeric world, perpetuated by performers of the epics, existed during and after the period of their performances. It is natural to wonder about the extent of Homer's influence, not only on the art and literature of the ancient world, but also on possibly behavior, politics, and even later law in the ancient world. Remember Pisistratus's ploy. For the classical Athenians, Homer was not just entertainment. His poems were a foundation of education, morality, and public discussion. Socrates was encouraging young people to question traditional interpretations rather than simply accept them. By challenging accepted views about the Theon, heroes, and morality found in Homer, Socrates was seen by some Athenians as undermining the values upon which their society was built. For many Greeks, debates about Homer were debates about how young people should be educated. All of this invites a larger question of how much actual ancient Greek behavior and decision making was shaped by Homeric poetry. Homer was present not only in their theater, in their places of learning, but also in their public discourse, their political debates, and their moral education and enforcement. His stories supplied models, warnings, and ideals for the classical Greeks. If imagination can help drive the political decisions and even wars, then Homeric poetry may have exercised a degree of influence that is difficult to measure. Even if modernity can never fully recover Homer himself, the impact of the Homeric tradition on Greek culture remains one of the most remarkable facts of the ancient world. Scholars sometimes say that ancient audiences already knew the plots of the Iliad and Odyssey, and they're familiar with the characters before hearing any particular performance. Homer was not introducing Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus as if they were new inventions. It is probable that he was working with figures who already lived in the shared imagination of the audience. How Homer chose to narrate is what was important. The Trojan War ends, and then Odysseus moves through flashbacks, memories, reports, and return narratives. Odysseus himself tells much in the middle of the poem, choosing which events to narrate in detail. The narrative speeds up during routine travel, or while he's passively waiting, and events that do not deeply change Odysseus or his household are sped up as well. The poem spends time where meaning and stakes are present. His cleverness, tests of loyalty, hospitality or lack thereof, discretion, restraint, when he's recognized while he's in disguise, and the restoration of order are where the poem slows down. The poem arranges events in a mental order rather than merely constructing a strict chronology. Time is always bending to perspective and memory. This is not just a narrative device, it is an accurate way of presenting how a mind processes time, especially the mind of an aging man who has so much to remember and reflect upon. Some scenes in the Odyssey are given more attention simply because they are more important. This reflects how real life feels. Moments when Odysseus reveals who he is or is recognized by others, they're unfolding slowly. They often bring back a flood of memories, and so the audience is plunged into narratives about memory. The poet spends more time on these scenes to make them feel real and dramatic. Penelope's testing of Odysseus is drawn out to build suspense, and Odysseus's identity is revealed little by little in those scenes. By contrast, long stretches of travel or captivity, such as Odysseus's 7 years with Calypso, whose name means covering, Calypso's name means covering like a veil would, veiled, are told quickly because there is less happening in that part of the story from a stakes and mental perspective. The mixing of the narrative elements are artistically masterful, and they are the work of a great poet. There is even a long delay before we properly meet Odysseus. The poem begins with Telemachus in Ithaca, with the suitors and the disorder of the household. Odysseus himself, the protagonist, is not introduced directly until Song 5 out of 24. This delay matters greatly. Before we see Odysseus, we see the absence of Odysseus. We see what his disappearance means, what his disappearance has done to his son, his wife, his servants, his oikos, and his chiefdom. This raises the question of what Homer is doing. Is he making an authoritative statement about the past? Is he reporting? Is he being poetic and filling in gaps where necessary? Is Homer reporting the last of prehistory? Is he reporting the last of a heroic age at a time in which direct descendants of the gods were rare and finally finite? The lineages undeniably date back to the time of gods and heroes. The poem is explicit about this. The peoples descended from the gods or semi-divine ancestors whose genealogies represent places and tribes and could represent migrations or traces of what modern people might call history are in the poems. However, what Homer is also undoubtedly doing is telling a deeply personal human story about two individuals, an aging man and an aging wife, deeply thinking about and discussing their marriage. Homer is also rejecting singular readings, especially with respect to emotion, behavior, or moral judgments of living beings. It rejects absolutes. Violence is often portrayed negatively, but the reasons for violence are usually explained. Often the victims are blamed for actions that led to the violence. Fate appears through greater forces, especially through the gods, but human choice remains meaningful. The world of Homer is not governed by any simple moral formula. This complexity, of course, appears even in the description of Odysseus himself. Calling him wily or complicated is not enough. A more literal translation of many turns is better. It describes both Odysseus and the narrative itself. A more literal translation allows the reader to absorb the poetic language and consider the etymology and meaning for themselves. Appreciate the multiple meanings that branch out in every direction from the Odyssey as it promises at the beginning of the poem. These questions can be applied to a famous example, to the Trojan horse. Did it happen as later retellings describe it? What are the sources? How does Demodocus present it, the character bard in the Odyssey? Or another example, how are the varying accounts of Aias, Ajax's death received by the characters in Homer? By Homeric audiences? By modern audiences? What are the differences? The poems are constantly surrounded by alternative versions in the minds of the audience. The Odyssey also plays with inversion and irony. Perhaps more explicitly, guests are fed, but guests may also be fed on. When Odysseus approaches the Cyclops, he says he wants to see whether these people are savages who do not have customs of Xenia or hospitality. That question becomes terrifying. The Cyclops turns hospitality upside down immediately. He does not feed the guests, he feeds on them. The poem's instability is intentional and is a part of its meaning. Odysseus's many names and epithets deepen this complexity and always reflect the poem. He's polytropos, he's of many turns. He is polymetis, of many minds, many counsels. Sometimes he's referred to even like Dios, godlike, and at times he's almost treated as though he's about to approach the divine, yet he is not a god. He is not going to be promoted into one, as some people had been. He comes close enough to the Theoi to have their attention, but he always remains one of the Brotoi. In Song 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus visits the dead and becomes familiar with their condition. This is more than just a memory. He sees their fate firsthand. The dead have no future and they're miserable. Odysseus tells the Phaeacians that he tried to console Achilles by saying that Achilles rules over the shades and he should not grieve at having died because of his Kleos. But Achilles directly rejects Odysseus, telling him his Kleos has saved him. He tells Odysseus not to speak favorably of death, and he says he would rather live as a servant to a poor man with little to live on than rule over all of the wasted dead. Achilles realizes that life is better than death, even without glory, even in poverty, even under another man's authority. In Hades, Achilles' Kleos does not satisfy him. He presides over shades, but has no purpose left. The dead's individuality is preserved, these souls are miserable. The characters in the Odyssey themselves sometimes possess names that seem to anticipate aspects of their fate or their personality. Antinous, often interpreted as something like opposed to understanding or against good counsel, becomes the suitor most incapable of recognizing what is happening around him. He cannot perceive that the old beggar he's treating poorly is Odysseus, and Antinous ultimately dies in part because of his failure of judgment. Anticlea, Odysseus' mother, bears a name that can be interpreted as standing in tension with Kleos, glory, anti-Clea, anti-glory, anti-Kleos. Her role in the poem is deeply connected to the costs of Odysseus' pursuit of fame and adventure. Odysseus himself bears a traditional name associated with pain, anger, hatred, or causing suffering. Odysseus is the pain causer, but he is also one who experiences lots of pain. Euryclea, the nurse who recognizes Odysseus' bias scar, bears a name associated with far-reaching or widespread glory. Euryclea, widespread glory, widespread Kleos. Names in Homer are often more than labels. They become a part of the network of meanings surrounding a character. This complexity makes Odysseus unlike any other figure in Greek myth. We know him for his mind more so than his actions. Odysseus' grandfather, Autolycus, is described in the Odyssey as being the greatest liar and perjurer in the world. This is a family tradition that presents deception not merely as a personal characteristic, but almost as a hereditary trait of Odysseus' family. Tricks were familiar features of the ancient world, like many trickster figures found in the world of mythology throughout history. Odysseus survived everything he went through by outthinking. This is why he is favored by Athena for his polymetis, for his many counsels or many minds. Odysseus's many-mindedness, polymetis, polytropos, his many turns, is not always necessarily a positive trait, but it makes him the most intellectually interesting character in the epic cycle. Other heroes often act more than they think. Odysseus thinks and then he acts, and we are given perspective on his thinking in more depth than other characters. His mind is placed closer to the audience than the minds of most Homeric characters, even. We are allowed to observe his calculations, doubts, his deceptions, his plans before we see their consequences. In this sense, he resembles trickster figures found in many traditions, figures whose intelligence allows them to navigate situations that strength alone can't solve. His intelligence is both his greatest asset, but it is also the source of many of his problems, like other tricksters in mythology. Even Odysseus' name reflects this complexity. Ancient Greeks themselves connected Odysseus' name with pain, suffering, anger, causing distress, being the victim of pain. It functions almost as a cognomen within the epic tradition. Why should it be surprising that a protagonist called Pain Causer makes mistakes, causes suffering, suffers greatly himself, and leaves destruction in his wake? The openness of the Odyssey allows both the audience and the characters within the poem to criticize Odysseus. Eurylochus questions his judgment. Penelope tests him. Athena occasionally reprimands and corrects him. The audience is free to agree or disagree with these criticisms. Odysseus is not presented as morally perfect, he is presented as human. In all of his lies and many turns, he ends up hurting people and himself. He is the pain causer. Traditional names reinforce this broader system of meaning. Telemachus' name, often interpreted as far fighter or one who fights at a distance, makes sense to audiences familiar with the absence of his father Odysseus, who is always far away and fighting, and the legacy Telemachus must inherit. Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, literally meaning new warrior, continues the heroic identity of his father Achilles into a new generation. Circe's name, meaning kestrel, a bird, describes her elusive abilities in her predation and her unpredictable and magical nature. Such names function as miniature stories embedded within the narrative. They are meaningful because the audience already knows the larger traditions surrounding these characters. The Iliad, the Odyssey, and likely other poems of the epic cycle begin with a narrative question directed toward the muse. Tell me, muse. The openings are so familiar that they are easy to overlook how strange they are. Who is speaking to the muse? Who is the muse? Is the performer receiving knowledge, inspiration, memory, authority, direct words, or all of these at once? Before the story even begins, Homer is placing another voice between himself and the audience. The poems are therefore beginning with a framing narrative before any hero appears. The Odyssey repeatedly disorients its audience. The audience is still learning important things about Odysseus' family, his family history, and relationships near the end of the poem. The audience learns about his mothers, his biological mother, Anticlea, and his surrogate nurse mother, Euryclea, very late in the narrative, in Song 19 of 24 of the Odyssey. Information arrives when it becomes meaningful rather than when it would fit a chronological structure. Homer wants the audience to experience the inner workings of a mind rather than simply receive information. The subjective mind of Odysseus almost requires Homer to bend time. Consider the chronology. 7 years with Calypso, 9 days cling to wreckage after the destruction associated with Scylla and Charybdis of Odysseus' ships, a year with Circe, long periods of travel, waiting, mourning, captivity, and wandering. If all of these events were narrated in equal detail, the poem would be impossible to tell. Instead, Homer summarizes years in a few lines, then spends hundreds of lines describing a single conversation, recognition, or an object or a decision. If a house has meaning to Odysseus, it is described in detail. The materials from which they are built are described. Who made them and why they were made that way are described. Those details often carry symbolic meaning. Penelope in Odysseus' bed is not simply furniture, it is a metaphor for the marriage itself. The Trojan horse provides another example. It is perhaps the most famous story associated with the Trojan War, yet it is never mentioned in the Iliad because the poem ends well before the conclusion of that war. In the Odyssey, the Trojan horse emerges gradually through songs and recollections rather than through direct narration. The Trojan horse is already a myth when the Odyssey begins. Homer is assuming that the audience already knows the important events of the epic cycle, at least in summary, and therefore Homer chooses to focus on their meaning and their recognition by the audience and by the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey rather than merely their occurrence. There is, of course, a chain of events in the Odyssey, but the psychological state created by the Odyssey is one of continual reflection. The audience is repeatedly pulled in and out of the present by memories, stories, prophecies, dreams, songs, flashbacks, and multiple narrators. Odysseus narrates, Demodocus the bard narrates, the primary narrator narrates. Characters recount stories they have heard from other people. Stories exist within stories within stories. As a result, the audience is never oriented solely in the present moment. The present is always haunted by the past. It is haunted by memory, by prophecy, by past decisions, by absent people, by future consequences, and by alternative versions of events. The Odyssey is therefore not simply about a man returning home. It is a story about how an older human being is experiencing time itself. Odysseus does not live entirely in the present. He is living among a confusing context of stories. Homer understood this, and the structure of the Odyssey reflects it at every level. If we were to construct an absolute chronology for what is now called the epic cycle and some of the surrounding mythology that happened before the epic cycle, it might look something like the following. Such a chronology is artificial to some extent, because many of the stories originated separately and developed over long periods of time. Nevertheless, both ancient and modern audiences often imagine them as forming a continuous narrative stretching from the age of the gods to the beginnings of recorded history. The sequence begins with a Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympian gods. In this generation-defining conflict, Zeus and his allies overthrow the older order represented by Cronus and the other Titans. The result is the establishment of the Olympian world, familiar from Homer and Hesiod. The Theon received their domains, powers, and places within the cosmos. Before Hesiod's telling of the Titanomachy, these stories about the replacement of the Titans by the Theoi would have taken place around the Mediterranean over centuries. There were many stories from many different cultures that inspired the Titanomachy. Next comes the Theban cycle, a separate but equally important collection of stories centered on the city Thebes. This includes the story of Oedipus, the conflict between his son Eteocles and Polynices, the expedition of the Seven against Thebes, and the later victory of their descendants. By the time of the Trojan War, many of the heroes of these earlier stories were already dead, and their deeds belonged to an earlier heroic generation. Next is Ilias, the Iliad. The name means the poem concerning Ilios, another name for Wilusa, Troy. Rather than narrating the entire war, the Iliad focuses on only a few weeks in its 10th year. Its central theme is the wrath of Achilles, beginning with his quarrel with Agamemnon, continuing through the death of Patroclus, and ending with a reconciliation between Achilles and Priam at Hector's funeral. The Aethiopus followed the Iliad. It introduced new Trojan allies arriving after Hector's death. The most famous is Memnon, the king of the Ethiopians, and the son of the dawn goddess Eos. Memnon kills Antilochus, the son of Nestor and one of Achilles' closest companions. Antilochus is particularly important because he is a young warrior who informs Achilles of Patroclus' death in the Iliad. Achilles avenges Antilochus by killing Memnon, much as he avenged Patroclus by killing Hector. The poem concludes with Achilles' own death at the hands of Paris, who was aided by Apollo. Ilias Micra, the Little Iliad, continued the story of the Trojan War after Achilles' death. It described the struggle to obtain Achilles' armor between Odysseus and Aias, Aias' suicide following his defeat, the arrival of Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, and Philoctetes, whose bow and arrows were used against Troy. The poem culminated in the construction of a wooden horse, which was conceived by Odysseus. The Iliupersis, the sack of Troy, the destruction of Troy, narrated the final fall of the city. The Achaeans, Argives, and Daunians entered Troy through a wooden horse. Priam is killed, the city is burned, many of the Trojan leaders die, while others are enslaved. The poem depicted the destruction of the greatest city of the heroic age and the end of the war itself. The next epic is the Nostoi, meaning returns. This single epic, or group of songs, described homeward journeys of the coalition leaders after Troy's destruction. Not all of these returns were happy. Agamemnon returns home only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra. Menelaus wanders for years before reaching Sparta. Other heroes suffer shipwrecks, divine punishment, exile, and death. Nostoi explores the consequences of victory and the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after war. The Odyssey is the most famous surviving Nostos. It follows Odysseus during the final stages of his 10-year journey home. The poem combines travel narrative, adventures, family drama, reflections on memory, identity, and mortality, rather than focusing on war, like much of the epic cycle. It focuses on return, recognition, the restoration of an oikos. Odysseus defeats the suitors, he reunites with Penelope and Telemachus, and he restores order to Ithaca. The cycle concluded with the Telegony. In this final poem, Telegonus, the son of Odysseus and Circe, unknowingly arrives in Ithaca and kills Odysseus during a conflict. After discovering the truth, Telegonus brings Odysseus' body to Circe's island. Later traditions described unusual marriages linking the surviving families of Odysseus, Penelope, Telegonus, and Telemachus. The poem marks the true end of the heroic age. The heroes of the epic cycle occupy a position between mortality and divinity. Many belong to hereditary lineage touched by the divine or descended from the Theon. They possess extraordinary ability. They receive extraordinary kleos. They command extraordinary respect. Ordinary people stand in awe of them. The audience is not like them. The audience cannot fully compare themselves to their abilities, their responsibilities, or even their suffering and struggles. Hesiod simply presents the heroes as a distinct race superior to ordinary mortals. Yet Odysseus remains unusual among them because despite his heroic status, he is constantly reflecting upon himself and his circumstances as an ordinary person would. The end of the epic cycle marks what the ancient peoples of Hellas often imagined as their deepest past. The heroes are dead, their descendants inherit the world, and the mythoi gradually give way to history. Figures such as Telegonos become founders of cities and dynasties, and so ends prehistory. If one were to reconstruct the actual chronology of Odysseus' life during the Odyssey, it would be very different from the order in which the story is told. The sequence would begin with the conflict with the Kikiones, then the Lotus Eaters, the Kuclops, Aeolus, and the Laestrygonians, and Circe, and the underworld journey, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of Helios, Calypso's island, the departure from Calypso, shipwreck, Odysseus finding himself in Scheria, returning to Ithaca, the recognition scenes in Ithaca, the slaughter of the suitors, and the restoration of order of Odysseus' Oikos. However, Homer is deliberately withholding most of this chronology until halfway through the poem. Not only is the Odyssey not told in sequence, but it is told through a variety of narrative styles. Homer is shifting between the present, the past, memories, direct narrations, speeches, stories within stories, flashbacks, recognition scenes, and prophecies. Homer switches between who is narrating. The result is that the audience experiences the poem as this aging man Odysseus experiences his own life, mostly through reflection and almost a constant comparative state to the past. The Odyssey's structure can be divided into 6 groups of 4 songs each. Songs 1 through 4 are often called the Telemachy because they are centered on Telemachus. These songs are primarily told through third-person narration. Odysseus is absent. The audience sees the effects of Odysseus's absence. Telemachus is searching for information about his father as the audience is. The audience hears stories about Odysseus from the most reliable narrator, Nestor, and from Menelaus, and the audience learns about Odysseus through memories and reports rather than any direct observation. This also preserves the nature of doubt and oral culture that puts the audience in the period and in the experience of Telemachus, making his search feel more real and personal. Songs 5 through 8 introduce Odysseus himself. The narrative returns to the present. We find Odysseus on Calypso, the Coverer's island, after 7 years of captivity. His departure, shipwreck, arrival among the Phaeacians, and reception by Nausicaa and Alcinous are told through conventional third-person epic narration. However, the audience still knows almost nothing about what happened during the previous 10 years. Odysseus is a mystery. The audience knows where he is now, but they do not know how he arrived there. Songs 9 through 12 are perhaps the most unusual section of the Odyssey. Here, Odysseus becomes the narrator. At a banquet among the Phaeacians, he tells the stories of his wanderings after Troy. This is a first-person framed narrative. The Cyclops, Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of Helios, are all presented through Odysseus' own voice. This creates distance and raises the possibility that Odysseus is not a reliable narrator. We are hearing a survivor recount events years after they happened. The audience must constantly decide how much to trust Odysseus, just as the technologically advanced Phaeacians at the banquet must. It is an epic within an epic. The most fantastical portion of the Odyssey is therefore narrated by a character with the greatest incentive and ability to embellish, persuade, and selectively remember. Songs 13 through 16 is a return to the present and to the third-person narration. Odysseus arrives in Ithaca but remains disguised. The narrative becomes one of concealment, planning, and eventual recognition. The shape-shifting goddess Athena reveals information to Odysseus, who often disguises himself. Odysseus conceals information from others. Telemachus returns home. Father and son are reunited. The dominant narrative mode becomes dramatic irony, possibly. The audience knows Odysseus' identity, while most characters do not. Songs 17 through 20 slow time dramatically. Very little chronological time passes. Instead, the narrative focuses on tests, conversations, insults from the suitors in particular, observations, prophecies, memories, and recognitions. Argos recognizes Odysseus, even though he only knew Odysseus when he was a puppy. Euryclea recognizes Odysseus. Penelope begins to suspect Odysseus is here. The narrative repeatedly interrupts itself with flashbacks and stories. The famous Scar narrative in Song 19 transports the audience decades into the past to Mount Parnassus on the mainland before abruptly returning to the present. Memory constantly intrudes upon immediate action in these songs. Songs 21 through 24 bring the poem to its conclusion in the poem's most common narrative, the third-person narrative. The bow contest, killing of the suitors, recognition by Penelope, the visit to Laertes, and then Athena's final intervention occur rapidly. The narrative becomes increasingly immediate and dramatic. Yet even here, Homer is interrupting the present with recollections, genealogies, explanations, stories of the dead. Song 24 even returns to Hades, allowing dead characters to discuss events that have just occurred among the living. The effect of arranging the narrative this way is profound. The audience is almost never located entirely in the present, and the present is continually interrupted by memory, prophecy, dreams, stories, songs, recollections, bards singing about the past. All of the characters remember the past in different ways. Even the dead remember the past. Even prophecies create memories of events that have not yet occurred. The result is a narrative world in which time is layered rather than linear. This is why the Odyssey feels like a story about the consciousness of someone who has lived a long life as much as a story about travel. There is a chain of events, but psychologically, the audience exists in a state of continual reflection. The poem constantly moves the listener between what happened, what is happening, and what might happen. The ability of the audience to orient itself is never solely in the present. The present is always haunted by memory, expectation, loss, and possibilities. The Odyssey moves through different layers of time to explain the names of characters and how prophecies and fates come about. Odysseus' grandfather, Autolycos, names him Odysseus, a name traditionally associated with pain, suffering, anger, and causing suffering. One might even view this as a selfish act by his grandfather, imposing his own character experiences upon a baby. Similar tensions appear throughout Greek myth, where older generations pass on both their achievements and their burdens. In Song 11, Odysseus visits Hades and physically encounters the shades of heroes, kings, relatives, and even demigods from the past. He speaks directly with people he knew and had suffered: Anticlea, Agamemnon, Achilles, Aias. He's not merely remembering the past, he directly encounters it. He can physically get far enough away from the normal world. He can get mentally far enough away to have enough exposure to the world and to the Theon and accumulate enough Kleos that this is what type of ability he has. Odysseus himself is a bridge between generations, and he can move between the world of the living and the world of memory. The changes in the narrative forms in the Odyssey is supported by the changing moods created by how the characters speak in the story. Different characters speak in different styles. Zeus often uses more elevated syntax than mortal characters. For example, when he reflects on the fate of human beings, Zeus says, "It is shameless the way these protoi blame the theoi." This feels like the voice of a ruler looking down on the entire human condition. Poseidon often feels even less human than the other Olympians. His speeches are elemental. Poseidon says, even if he escapes death, let him come home late and in pain, having lost all of his companions. Athena and Hermes interact with Brotoi in ways that feel more familiar and personal. Athena often speaks like a mentor or advisor. Athena says, "You must not cling any longer to your boyhood," to Telemachus. Hermes tends to deliver practical guidance. Hermes says things like, "Here, take this herb, so that Kirke's magic will not overpower you." But the Theoi are always more than characters. They are representations of forces, places, and abstract cultural ideas. Athena might be the personification of strategy or skilled craftsmanship or civic order as she guides Odysseus and later restores peace in Ithaca. A god always has a personality, but the personality is also representing a force within nature. Odysseus is favored by Athena in part because he is a myth maker within a myth. There's the real Odysseus, the disguised Odysseus, and the many false Odysseus's he invents. In Song 13 through 19, Odysseus repeatedly tells Cretan lies, elaborate stories about himself. Odysseus is creating alternative versions of himself and alternative histories that center around Odysseus visiting Crete. At times, the poem almost contains multiple Odysseus's simultaneously. The irony becomes especially striking in Song 14, when Eumaeus tells the disguised Odysseus about a wandering Aetolian figure who once claims to have seen Odysseus alive in Crete among the Cretans with Idomeneus. Eumaeus dismisses the report as another false rumor spread by a stranger seeking hospitality, yet he unknowingly tells the story to the real Odysseus, who is himself inventing stories about Crete. Rumors about Odysseus circulate throughout the Mediterranean. They acquire credibility, change forms, they take on lives of their own. It is almost impossible to imagine that some of these stories originated with Odysseus himself to Eumaeus, but the audience knows better. Fake Odysseus is becoming so prolific that stories about him spread independently of the real man. In discerning this fact from fiction, these lies from truth, sorting through rumors, constructing a real chronology, the Phaeacians, the audience of Odysseus, occupy a unique position within the Odyssey. The Phaeacians are not merely another people Odysseus encounters. In many ways, they may resemble the audience of the Odyssey. Within the poem, they become Odysseus's audience. They're sitting and listening, questioning possibly, they're having emotional reactions as he recounts his adventures. This raises an interesting possibility. Is the audience of the Odyssey represented inside the Odyssey by the Phaeacians? The Phaeacians are unusually prosperous, sophisticated, and distant from the hardships of the wider world. They stand between the heroic age and the audience hearing the poem. Through them, Homer might have created an audience within the narrative itself. This contributes to one of the central effects of the poem, disorientation. The Odyssey is purposefully disorienting. Geographic space, time, and mental space are superimposed upon one another. A voyage across the Mediterranean becomes a journey through memory, identity, and consciousness. Odysseus wanders physically, but he also wanders in his memory, in time, through stories, recollections, disguises, and alternative versions of himself, and even sometimes lies. The audience is carried along with him. The poem constantly asks questions that extend beyond geography. Can Odysseus return home physically? Yes. Can he return home to the same home he remembers? Maybe not. Can he maintain the person he was when he was younger? Once he compares himself to the other identities that have developed, who is he really? These questions are at the center of Nostos' return. The Odyssey is deeply interested in the relationship between fate, divine influence, and human choice. The Theoi constantly intervene in the Iliad and the Odyssey, yet the choices of the Brotoi still matter greatly. Odysseus's companions choose to eat the cattle of Helios, which leads to their death. The suitors choose to remain in Odysseus's oikos, which leads to their death. Fate and free will are not presented as opposites but intertwined forces. The same is true of these people's cultural and political freedoms. Individuals acted within the limits posed by the Theoi, their kin leaders, and their customs, yet their decisions remain meaningful and they have a great deal of autonomy. They have little in the way of law or direct commands governing their decisions. The nature of Odysseus's power is unusual. He is neither the strongest warrior nor the most powerful ruler, yet the Theoi pay attention to him. This is a fantastical element, but it serves as an explanation for his significance within the world of the poem. Athena almost always intervenes on his behalf. Poseidon always opposes him. The fact that the gods concern themselves with Odysseus elevates him among ordinary Brotoi. What does Odysseus own? And what is the nature of his ownership? What is Odysseus king or chief of? These questions lie at the center of the Odyssey. Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, but his kingship is not that of a modern state governed by formal law and institution. He is closer to a chieftain than he is a king in the modern sense. His authority rests upon personal relationships, reputation, time, his wealth, his lineage, and the ability to maintain order of his oikos. Throughout the poem, nearly everything that belongs to him is contested. His household is occupied by suitors. His wife is being courted by rivals. His son lacks authority. His servants are divided in their loyalties. Even his own identity is questioned. The Odyssey is therefore not merely about returning home, but about recovering ownership, authority, reputation, and place in the world. In the narrative, by the time we encounter Odysseus, he has outlived many of his peers and accumulated an immense amount of experience. He exists in a nearly constant state of reflection. He wonders whether he can begin again when he returns home. He wonders whether home still possesses the value it once did. He spends years in the company of Calypso and later Circe, both of whom offer him alternatives to his former life. He repeatedly is confronted with the possibility of abandoning the past and constructing a new future. Yet he always longs for Nostos. The central question becomes whether a man who has changed so much can ever truly return home. By the end of the poem, this question is answered. Odysseus does reestablish order within his oikos, but only after discovering that homecoming requires not merely a return of the body, but a recovery of his identity. Odysseus's companions followed him largely because of time, honor, prestige, rather than because of fealty or a rigid military chain of command. Characters identify themselves through their ancestries, which, depending on who they are, can be traced back to divine lineages. Yet Homer also recognizes forms of kinship that extend beyond blood and famous lineage. Odysseus repeatedly refers to Eurycleia, his nurse, in language associated with motherhood. The poem understands that family can be created through memory and shared experience as well as birth. Odysseus shares something like kinship with his fellow chiefs. Above Odysseus stands Agamemnon, whose authority is reinforced by ritual legitimacy and by the support of Zeus himself. Zeus is the strongest of gods and the figure most closely associated with authority, kingship, and order among the Theoi. Agamemnon is therefore not simply the most powerful king among the Achaeans, he is also the leader whose position is most closely aligned with divine hierarchy. Odysseus is also bound to Agamemnon, in part because of the oath of Tyndareus, which was Odysseus's idea. While courting Penelope, Odysseus advised Tyndareus to require all of Helen's suitors to swear an oath that they would defend the chosen husband against any future threat. In exchange, he helped Odysseus secure Penelope as a bride. When Helen was later taken to Troy, that oath, which was Odysseus's idea, compelled the kings to join the expedition. One cannot help but wonder whether Odysseus's own cleverness helped bring about the war itself. After all, again, he is the pain causer. Odysseus's status as chief and his oikos is symbolized also through wealth, order, and numbers. Eumaeus, though poor himself, describes Odysseus as perhaps the wealthiest man in Ithaca and among the richest even on the mainland. He lists 12 herds of cattle, 12 flocks of sheep, 12 droves of pigs, and 12 herds of goats. The repetition of dodeca, the number 12, is unlikely to be accidental. 12 had symbolic weight throughout the ancient Mediterranean. 12 Olympian gods, 12 labors of Heracles, 12 signs in the zodiac, 12 titans in some traditions, and even Plato's cosmic dodecahedron in the Timaeus. The number suggests completeness, order, and proper arrangement. Odysseus' estate is presented as a world functioning as it should. The end of the Odyssey is fundamentally a story about the restoration of order rather than simply a triumph over the suitors. The killing of the suitors is only one step in a larger process. The true goal is the restoration of Odysseus's oikos, the household, his family, loyal servants, his property, and relationships that had fallen into disorder. This focus is entirely consistent with the genre of the Nostos. The returns of the heroes are not stories about winning wars, they are stories about what happens after wars and leaders' attempts to come home and to regain their identities. The ending of the Odyssey differs from later classical Greek tragedy. Great suffering occurs throughout both types of works, and audiences feel profound sympathy for the characters in each, but the suffering is broadly followed by resolution in the Odyssey. Odysseus reunites with Penelope. Athena repeatedly aids him. His intelligence ultimately saves him, and he restores order to Ithaca. The story does not have an end in a downward catastrophe as it might in later Greek tragedy. This resolution troubled some later writers. It troubled Aeschylus and other tragedians precisely because the Homeric world ultimately allows Odysseus to come home. This is a Homeric return, not a tragedian's return. The audience may choose to judge the characters according to a particular moral standard, but the poem repeatedly demonstrates the dangers of doing so. However, despite this, decay, the proper way to behave, is present throughout the Homeric poems, but is rarely imposed upon the audience in a rigid or systematic way. Even the suitors are not a unified moral or political body. Amphinomus is portrayed as thoughtful and comparatively restrained, while Antinous is violent, arrogant, and openly abusive. Eurymachus often attempts to persuade, while others prefer to intimidate. Their interests and temperaments differ significantly. Likewise, the Theoi rarely agree with one another. Athena consistently supports Odysseus, while Poseidon is relentlessly opposing him. Zeus often acts less as a moral authority and more as a mediator, attempting to balance competing interests. Even on Olympus, there is disagreement. Of course, the Rotoi fail to agree among themselves. In the Iliad, Agamemnon and Achilles nearly destroy the Achaean war effort because their personal interests collide. Odysseus's own companions repeatedly reject his advice. For example, they open the bag of winds given by Aeolus because they suspect Odysseus is withholding treasure from them. Despite explicit warnings, the crew slaughters the cattle of Helios. The conflict between them is not presented as simple struggle between good and evil, but as a clash of competing claims to honor, status, and authority. Throughout both poems, unity is rare and personal disagreements are common. The pursuit of Kleos, the ultimate pursuit of the heroes, results in unexpected outcomes. Consider a connection between the endings of the Iliad and the Odyssey. In Iliad, Song 7, Hector imagines someone sailing on a ship in the future, and from that ship, the person will see a huge tumbus, a huge burial mound, from the sea. The person who is interred is the person who was killed by Hector. Hector will have achieved such great kleos that even the person he kills will be remembered forever. That's how famous Hector will be. In Iliad Song 24, however, it is Hector who receives his tomb, and the poem ends with his burial. Hos oikou amphi epon taphon Hectoros hippodamoi o. So they perform the funeral rites of Hector, the tamer of horses. The Odyssey returns to this theme. In Song 24, Achilles' tomb is described as completed reality, fulfilling the expectation established earlier in the Iliad. The two poems therefore end with the tombs of their greatest heroes. The Iliad ends with Hector's burial mound, while the Odyssey concludes by recalling Achilles' burial mound. In both cases, it is the hero's companions who raise the tomb and remember their kleos. The dead do not preserve their own kleos. Their memories survive because others remember them, bury them, and continue to tell their stories. Both poems are very violent. This fascination with violence is neither casual nor celebratory. Violence is gory and tragic. In Iliad, Song 13, the point of the bronze spear went through him above the nose besides his eye. The bones cracked, both gore-covered eyes fell into the dust before his feet, and he sat there with his arms stretched out. Yet violence is also accepted in both poems as a part of the world inhabited by chiefs and their men. The Iliad dwells upon the deaths of warriors in extraordinary detail. Achilles and Hector know that the pursuit of Kleos will likely bring about their own deaths. The audience is not shielded from these consequences. The audience, in their personal lives, were not shielded from the consequences of violence and war either. There are Greek Dark Age paintings on pottery that depict carrion vultures eating the intestines of war dead. Other prehistoric people had similar ideas about violence. The 2,000-year-old Irish epic Tonbo Cúilíne, the cattle raid of Cooley, the central epic of the Ulster cycle. There are lines such as, "There was not left of them but one man's thigh upon another man's shoulder, and one man's lung upon another man's liver." Prehistoric audiences were familiar with violence and its aftermath, and they could relate to the characters and situations directly when they suffered violence. If absolutes are not the basis of the Homeric world, then what is? The answer may be nature itself and the observation of how human beings choose to behave within it. The poems repeatedly invite the audience to watch what happens when Bretoi pursue honor, wealth, revenge, survival, love, kleos, or nostos. They invite the audience to observe the consequences of those pursuits rather than simply accept a predetermined moral lesson. The legacies of the dead further illustrate this point. Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, and even Odysseus do not ultimately control how they will be remembered. There are survivors who shape their legacies. The living continue the story and determine how the dead will be understood. In the Odyssey, as a dead shade, Achilles himself offers a perspective on his own fame when he tells Odysseus he would rather be living as a laborer than a king among the dead. Hector's reputation survives through the grief of Andromache, Priam, and the Trojans. Kleos is not fixed, it is reshaped by those who remain to tell the dead stories, which later became the role that the poets inherited. Homer was aware of this responsibility. To understand the different types and depth of narrative that exist in the Odyssey, one could examine Odysseus's return to Ithaca. Within a relatively small portion of the poem, Homer moves between radically different forms of storytelling, each containing great depth. While Odysseus visits the agricultural areas of Ithaca, he sits with Eumaeus, the swineherd, who tells Odysseus how, as a child prince, keep in mind this is a swineherd telling Odysseus that he used to be a prince, that he was kidnapped after a Phoenician slave woman in his father's household conspired with Phoenician pirates. This Phoenician slave persuaded the pirates to take her away, and they abducted the child Eumaeus with her. The woman is never given a famous personal name. Homer simply refers to her as a Phoenician woman or servant. She is therefore not remembered as an individual, but a type, a foreign woman whose betrayal changes the course of Eumaeus' life. This story serves several purposes. First, it explains why Eumaeus, despite being a swineherd, speaks and behaves with unusual dignity, intelligence, and loyalty. He was born the son of a chief before being carried away into slavery. Second, the story reinforces one of the central themes of the Odyssey. Households may fall apart. People are carried away from their homes and forced to wander. Eumaeus' life may mirror Odysseus' own displacement. Third, the story contrasts betrayal and loyalty. The Phoenician woman betrays her household, while Eumaeus remains faithful to his. Throughout the poem, Homer repeatedly places treachery and loyalty side by side. Fourth, it leaves open a possibility that Odysseus is face to face with someone who can also fabricate stories. Later, while Odysseus is disguised as a beggar, neither he nor Telemachus physically recognizes the other. Once Athena reveals Odysseus, the two embrace and weep together. Yet Homer does not merely describe their tears. He says their cries are like birds of prey, like sea eagles, hawks, or vultures whose young have been taken from them. The image functions as one of Homer's many natural world allegories for what is happening in Ithaca. A father has been taken from his son, a household has been robbed of its proper order. The language of animals and nature is used to explain human suffering. Then there is Argos. Odysseus' dog lies at the edge of death, immobilized, neglected, and covered in dirt and manure. Yet Argos recognizes his master immediately. Suddenly, Homer inserts a flashback. We are shown Argos as a young hunting dog in the days before Troy, when Odysseus trained him and he lived up to his name, Argos, swift or shining. Within only a few lines, Homer connects an extraordinary number of ideas. Argos dies swiftly after seeing Odysseus. The suitors behave like scavengers, feeding in Odysseus' house. Odysseus himself is disguised as a beggar. Telemachus is often treated with disrespect one might show a dog. At times, he is effectively displaced from his own household. The condition of Argos becomes a reflection of the condition of Ithaca itself. The dog has been neglected, but the household has been neglected. Then Odysseus' nurse, Eurycleia, recognizes Odysseus through a scar on his leg received from a boar hunt when he was a child. What follows is one of the most remarkable narrative interruptions in ancient literature. Homer suddenly abandons the present moment of Eurycleia washing Odysseus' feet and describes scenes on Mount Parnassus on the mainland, physically distant from Ithaca and decades removed from the current action. Homer gives a detailed account of Odysseus' youth when he visited his grandfather Autolycus at his invitation to a hunting expedition on Mount Parnassus. This flashback narrative becomes so expansive that Homer even describes a hunted boar's perspective as it waits hidden in its lair before bursting forth to fight. The Odyssey says, "A thicket that is so dense the power of the wind, rain, and bright sunlight could never enter it, deep in fallen leaves. The boar leaps forth at Odysseus and gashes him on his leg, but he eventually recovers, but the gash leaves a scar." We are now several narrative layers removed from the present moment of Eurycleia washing Odysseus' feet. Then, just as suddenly, the flashback ends when Eurycleia drops Odysseus' foot after recognizing the scar. The scar story contains many themes that run through the entire poem. Autolycus, Odysseus' grandfather, is famous as a liar, trickster, thief, and perjurer. It is Autolycus who gives Odysseus his name, associated with pain traditionally, and anger and causing suffering. Anticleia, Odysseus' mother, is not in the naming scene flashback, but the nurse Eurycleia is. The old nurse is the one who witnesses the naming of Odysseus by his grandfather and later recognizes the scar. She was there when he was named Pain Causer. She saw his scar as a child. She sees his scar now as an adult. She has been with him through all of this pain. Autolycus promises gifts before he takes Odysseus to his home on the mainland. Odysseus receives a scar. His grandfather may, in some ways, be responsible for Odysseus's physical and prophetic pain causing both. Odysseus learns the world of deception, warfare, and injury on the mainland at the invitation of his grandfather. He lays siege to a fortified boar's lair. As an adult, he lays siege to Troy. At the beginning of the Odyssey, Telemachus walks with dogs while carrying a spear. Odysseus is described in the flashback in Song 19 when he's a boy as walking with dogs while carrying a spear during the boar hunt. The Mount Parnassus journey flashback ends when Eurycleia sees Odysseus' leg scar where the boar gashed him. She lets go of his leg. Odysseus' leg falls on the basin where his feet are being washed, and the water spills out of the basin onto the floor. Odysseus' foot lands on Ithaca. The basin rings out as it tumbles across the floor. Eurycleia is so overcome by a mix of grief and joy that she grabs Odysseus by his beard. The flashback is over. We understand his place. He understands his place. All of his journeys have come full circle. Ithaca's chief has returned. This flashback story, deep into the Odyssey, is a smaller Odyssey within the Odyssey. The audience cannot help but wonder whether Odysseus would have become Odysseus without his earlier journey to Parnassus. Odysseus, being carried around a banquet as a baby, sat on his grandfather's knee, and being named Painbringer, he's doomed by his grandfather. It's a selfish act by his grandfather. It's all about him. It's a common folly in old men seen in the Greek epic cycle. Would the Painbringer have become the Painbringer if this first adventure on Parnassus had never occurred? The boar is also creating more far-reaching and remarkable connections even to the Iliad. In Song 11 of the Iliad, Odysseus is compared to a boar bursting forth against many enemies. In Song 19 of the Odyssey, the hunted boar bursts forth against Odysseus. Odysseus once wore a boar tusk helmet in Song 10 of the Iliad. Homer does not explicitly tell the audience to connect these episodes. These similarities are accumulating naturally over the course of hundreds of years within the creativity by singers and for the audience over hours of listening to these songs. Continuing later in the homecoming, Penelope recognizes Odysseus gradually. Unlike Argos or Euryclea, she does not arrive at certainty immediately. Instead, Penelope gathers evidence over the course of several hours. Her final proof comes through the story of the marriage bed. Odysseus explains how he built the bed himself from a living olive tree rooted in the ground. He carved it, he shaped it, he decorated it with gold, silver, ivory, and he fastened it with leather. No ordinary man could move it because it is literally part of the house itself. But the bed is a metaphor for the marriage. Odysseus built it, he invested time and effort in it. The old olive tree is the foundation, but it also has precious materials inlaid. He wants to know whether the bed is still there. No man can move it. The relationship has endured. It is rooted, like the olive tree, in something living and permanent, but also was adjusted and shaped by a mortal man, its creator. Odysseus's homecoming is not complete until he has assembled a team consisting of his son Telemachus, the loyal swineherd Eumaeus, and the loyal cowherd Philoetius. Together, this band of 4 mortals slaughters about 108 suitors. Odysseus wields a legendary bow, the bow of Iphtius. He uses this bow until he runs out of arrows. Odysseus's team uses the 2-spear strategy of throwing with one bronze-tipped spear and thrusting with the other. They also use bronze swords. There is so much violence that the eating area of the hall itself and all of its furniture is left stained and battered and even destroyed in some places. There is, however, nothing left of the suitors. Later, in Song 24, while Odysseus is wandering across Ithaca, Odysseus walks into the orchard where his aged father, Laertes, has withdrawn from the world. Laertes is practically wearing rags, and he is grieving a son he believes will never return to the island. As he has done throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus first conceals his identity, and then he tests even his own father before finally revealing himself. At first, the old man Laertes cannot believe what he sees. But when Odysseus uncovers his scar on his leg, and Odysseus begins recalling one by one each of the fruit trees Laertes had given to Odysseus as child for the orchard, recognition no longer depends upon appearance alone. The scar and the orchard of old trees together become complementary forms of proof, one carried on Odysseus's body, and the other preserved within their memory and within nature itself. No disguise could imitate either these physical marks or their shared recollection of the past and nature. Soon afterward, Odysseus, Telemachus, Laertes, Eumaeus, and Philoetius fight against the many families of the slain suitors, who are attempting to avenge their dead relatives. Odysseus and his side is once again successful. This fight for the household has been undertaken by 3 generations of the same family and their servants, and they reaffirm not only Odysseus's kingship, but the legitimacy and endurance of Odysseus's entire lineage. The Odyssey concludes with more than a return of a chief. It ends with the restoration of an entire household, an unbroken line of succession, and an Ithaca returning to an ordered state of being. At this time, Athena finally imposes peace, ending the possibility of continued revenge killings by the two sides. These types of revenge spirals would have been a problem familiar to the ancient world's audiences listening to the Odyssey. Throughout these scenes, Homer is multiplying meanings rather than reducing them. Did Odysseus learn deception from Autolycus, or was it already a part of his nature? Did themes of pain, travel, and trickery appear once, twice, or three times? The poem begins by promising Pola many things. It promises many, several times at the beginning. Odysseus is a man of many turns, many journeys, many sufferings, many stories, and many identities. Even Euryclea's name is often interpreted as something like wide fame or far-reaching renown, which echoes the poem's concern with memory, reputation, and stories spreading across great distances. The result is that the physical and mental wandering, the dog allegories, the boar allegories, two mothers with corresponding names, grandfathers naming children after their own traits, gifts, scars, they all become interconnected. There are two mothers, two generations, two wars, and multiple journeys nested inside one another. What appears at first to be a random passage reveals itself to be deeply connected to the larger structure of the poem. Homer reminds the audience that every single story contains other stories, every journey contains earlier journeys, and every identity contains the earlier versions of itself. This level of depth exists throughout the Odyssey. The effect is cumulative. The audience is continually led to places it did not expect to go, and return to places it thought it had left behind. One moment they are in Ithaca, the next they are on Mount Parnassus. One moment they are looking through the eyes of a nurse, the next they are looking through the eyes of a boar. The poem is moving through places, time, memory, and many perspectives. This is fitting for a story about an old man like Odysseus. The question is not simply whether Odysseus can physically return to Ithaca. The question is whether a man who has experienced so much can ever truly return to the life he left behind after having lived through all the trials Odysseus has. The different types of narratives in the Odyssey are not just storytelling devices. They give us insight into the fact that the people at the time when this was composed had a pluralistic attitude and understood there could be different perspectives or mental states and different ways of seeing the world. The poem recognizes the ability of people to fall into and out of these mental states. The Odyssey recognizes that human beings contain multiple ways of perceiving events and recounting them to others. Odysseus, recounting the supernatural years after his encounters at a dinner party among the Phaeacians to an audience that may in some ways represent us, is a story within a story. For us, the audience of the Odyssey, the narratives of Song 9 through 12 are very different from a scene in which Odysseus is staring at his dog Argos. Odysseus is barely able to acknowledge the dog he left behind, because he must maintain his disguise that is being used against mortal man. The dog he scarcely had a chance to grow old with, the dog then dying in front of him while he secretly wipes away tears after the dog recognizes him, something that mortal man could not do. There is a very different experience between these two narratives. One can feel as though they are standing there witnessing the moment for themselves when the dog dies. At the banquet, the other is filled with memory, performance, distance, and storytelling. At the banquet among the Phaeacians, there is an attenuation and a dissociation. One might not entirely believe Odysseus the storyteller. One may begin to wonder whether this is the Odysseus, the same one we feel close to at times, like when we are certain about the pain he feels after seeing Argos the dog. There are times when the audience feels closer to Odysseus. There are times when the audience feels more distant from him. Resulting from this, the audience might begin to wonder whether Odysseus believes himself at times. what state of mind he might be in, and what he considers important. Is Odysseus his true self when he is telling stories and lying? Does he even have a true self? When he is embracing his son Telemachus and they are described as crying like animals, he appears sincere. But when he is telling stories involving shipwrecks, he may be in a state of performance. The audience wonders whether Odysseus' many turns are his so called fault, or the fulfillment of a prophecy, or fate, or his name, or his mother's or nurse's names. Anticlea, anti-fame, Euryclea, widespread fame. These are all types of questions that come forth in myth, but in the Odyssey, they are demonstrated at an internal mental level where the audience can connect with Odysseus more than other mythological characters. The audiences know Odysseus personally, but that does not mean they always trust him. This layering of identity mirrors the nature of this specific Odyssey myth itself. Stories accumulate, merge, and diverge across places and generations. Chronologies overlap. Truth becomes difficult to separate from human invention. The Odyssey itself begins with Odysseus in a kind of perfect oblivion, living with Calypso and being offered immortality. But immortality is not what Odysseus desires. He doubts whether he will ever physically return home, but in his mind he longs for Nostos to be complete. The poem begins with a man who possesses the opportunity to escape mortality and ends with a man who chooses instead to return to the imperfect and mortal and natural world because that is actually what gives his life meaning. This is never in question. We know only a few things for certain about Odysseus. We know that he traveled widely. We know that he caused pain and suffered pain himself. We know that he fulfilled the course laid out before him. Beyond that, the reasons why he acts as he does and how he truly feels about those actions remain among the most complex and impossible questions to answer with certainty. The Odyssey preserves uncertainty, and it allows the audience to wonder not only what happened to Odysseus, but who Odysseus is.